everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our #Actions for the Earth Symposium, a deep dive into the Biden Build Back Better plan and actions you can take. I'm Kevin J. Patel, the Executive Director and founder of OneUpAction, an international youth-led nonprofit organization supporting underserved and underrepresented youth combating the climate crisis by providing them the resources, funding, and tools to take direct action within their communities.
We envision a world free of the climate crisis, where communities have the education needed to live sustainably, and young people are given resources to implement their solutions to keep the environment healthy.
We believe in the unification of all, strength and diversity, and civilian power. By emphasizing the intersectionality of the climate crisis, we hope to act, educate, empower, and advocate for the installment of youth-led climate decision-making and to encourage young people to become leaders within their own communities.
And we are so excited to do just that. You'll learn more about the American Jobs Plan from our incredible panelists. Plus, we'll be giving you action items throughout the event, so you're not just listening, you're making a difference. It's imperative that we listen to the science and take bold steps to mitigate the climate crisis immediately. The change we need won't happen unless we demand it, and participating in this symposium is a significant starting point.
Exactly. We hope you all enjoy the event and are inspired by this amazing group of activists and experts. And thank you to our streaming partner, Good. You can visit our landing page to join the UA community, help us reach our goal of $20,000 in donation, and find all the action items you'll hear about today. Thank you all again, and we hope you enjoyed the event. And now welcome our wonderful host, Saad Amer.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you here on this wonderful Earth Day Eve. I'll be your host for today's programming. I am Saad Amer, the co-founder of Plus One Vote. And we're here today with OneUpAction, which is an incredible organization. OneUpAction is an intersectional youth-led organization that has a goal of providing young people with resources to fight the climate crisis and to work with their communities for a more regenerative future. What could be more perfect for today's wonderful Earth Day Eve? I'm really excited about the programming that we have today because, as you just saw in our intro video, it's so fundamental that we not only address the climate crisis, but that we listen to the voices of BIPOC, of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, as well as youth who are really at the forefront of this movement and are going to be some of the groups that are the most impacted by the climate crisis. Today, you're going to hear from 4 different panels, which are going to focus on environmental justice, transportation, agriculture and conservation, and clean energy. With each of these panels, I'll be introing them in, and I'm really excited for these because it's really a great way to get a holistic understanding of some major environmental issues that we're going to see major policy on from the administration over the next few days. So I'm really excited to have everyone get a chance to learn about these fundamentally important issues on the climate crisis. To lead up our programming, we have someone that I highly respect. He is today's keynote speaker. He is Bill McKibben. He is a contributing writer to The New Yorker, founder of 350.org, a professor in residence at Middlebury College. He won in 2014 the Right Livelihood Prize, which is sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize. He's written over a dozen books. I've read some of them, and oh my God, he once liked one of my tweets, and I was over the moon. So here is our amazing keynote speech from climate activist Bill McKibben.
Hello, everybody. My name's Bill McKibben, and I'm, as you can tell, an old guy, and I've been working on the climate issue for a very long time, which is why I know that this is a truly crucial moment in the history of this issue, in the history of this country, in the history of this planet. So let me back up for a minute and then come forward to the present. I wrote the first book about climate change. It came out in 1989, so a long time ago, before most of you were born. But even then, we knew most of what we know now. We knew enough that we could have been taking the steps that we're taking now 30 years ago. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon into the atmosphere. We knew it heated the planet. We didn't know exactly how hard and fast it was going to pinch, but we had a pretty good idea of just what a mess it was going to be. And indeed, it is a mess that it has turned out to become. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree so far, 1 degree Celsius, so 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's talk about where we are right now as we start. Half the summer sea ice in the Arctic is melted. We're seeing fires like we've never seen before. We're watching the sea level start to rise. We're seeing enormous storms. We had more hurricanes and tropical storms in the Atlantic last year than we've ever had before. And it was the hottest year we've ever measured on this planet. That's with a 1 degree increase in temperature. But on current business as usual trajectories, we're aiming at something like a 3 degree increase Celsius in the global temperature before the century is out. And if we let that happen, then we're not going to be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. The damage will be just too large. So our job right now, and it is an emergency job, is not to stop global warming. It's too late for that. It's to stop it from getting utterly out of control. And we're running out of time in which to accomplish that completely crucial task. Already, people are feeling the bad, dire effects of this. And the people who feel them first and hardest are, ironically, the people who did the least to cause the problem. That's almost the iron law of global warming. It's a system of incredible injustice here and around the world. Just to give you one tiny example, when we talk about those hurricanes in the Atlantic, the real damage they did last year was in Central America. The last 2 storms of the year hit Honduras really hard. We think that the damage they did was equivalent to 40% of the country's GDP. By contrast, the worst storm we ever had in this country, Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So in economic terms, 40 times worse. Which is why there's a lot of Hondurans starting to arrive at the southern border of the United States as climate refugees. And they have a pretty good case to make because Honduras didn't put any carbon into the atmosphere. They're a rounding error in the global calculations, but the US put more into the atmosphere than any country on Earth. And of course, within the US, it's the richest people and the people in the most privileged communities who have contributed the most carbon and who face the least consequences. So never forget that this is an issue of great injustice. There are things, however, that we can do about it, and right now is the moment to start. The moment to start because scientists have told us we have very little time left. The last big set of studies by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that we had until 2030 to cut our emissions in half if we wish to have any hope of meeting the targets we set in Paris. That's a huge, tall order, but it's possible to imagine it happening for 2 reasons. One, scientists and engineers have done a great job in making renewable energy cheap and efficient. Sun and wind are now the cheapest way to generate power around the planet, and we increasingly have cheap batteries in which to store that power. What that means is that if we wanted to make rapid change, we could. And the other thing that's happened over the last 10 years is that people, especially young people, have built a potent movement around the planet, maybe the biggest movement the planet's ever seen. People, of course, know about, figures like Greta Thunberg, and they should. Greta is fantastic, one of my favorite people to work with. But I think she'd be the first to tell you that the real story is there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs and 10 million followers, young people who understand that this is their future more than anyone else's at risk. Building that movement is so important because it comes as a counterbalance to the powerful weight of the fossil fuel industry, the coal and oil and gas companies that want to keep doing what they've been doing for a long time, even if it breaks the planet. And they know it'll break the planet. We've got a lot of great investigative reporting that shows they knew that 30 and 40 years ago, and yet they spread lies and disinformation about climate change that kept us from acting for 3 decades. So now we've got to go full speed ahead. And as we approach Earth Day 2021, we're actually seeing the first signs in the United States of an approach that looks anything like what we need to be doing to catch up to the physics of climate change. The American Jobs Plan that Joe Biden has put forward bears more than a passing resemblance to the Green New Deal that young people, especially headed by the Sunrise Movement, have been calling for. It talks about spending $2 trillion on infrastructure, much of it on infrastructure designed to lower carbon emissions. Trains and solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations and on and on and on. The basic technology that we need in order to make the transition that physics requires. Is it enough? No, there's probably nothing that would be enough. But is it a start? Yes. And one of the best things about it is that it targets the money that it wants to spend, especially at those low income and communities of color that have borne the brunt of climate change and are most at risk. So in many ways, it's a remarkable declaration of intent to get some things done. And it includes really beautiful touches like money for a climate corps of young people that will fan out to make sure that much of this work happens. It's not going to be an easy plan to get through our political system, because in our political system, the fossil fuel industry holds enormous power. Maybe you've heard of the Koch brothers. They're the biggest donors to the Republican Party, and they're the biggest oil and gas barons in the country. And so it'll be very hard to find the 50 senators that are necessary to pass anything and spend money that we have to spend. So it's important work to figure out how to make things like this happen, and important work to figure out how to keep standing up to the fossil fuel industry and weakening its power. That's why so many young people have gotten involved in things like the fossil fuel divestment movement, getting universities and other places to sell their stock in fossil fuel companies. It's why people have worked so hard behind the leadership of indigenous and frontline communities to stand up to pipelines like the Keystone XL or the Dakota Access Pipeline or Line 3, which is a huge fight underway in Minnesota right now. All of these fights are crucial. They have to happen soon. Climate change isn't like other battles where you can just take a little bit now and come back in a few years and do a little more and eventually get where you're going. Dr. Martin Luther King used to say at the end of his speeches, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I think what he meant by that was, this may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't make real progress soon, then we will never make it. No one has a plan for freezing the Arctic again once it melts. So now is the moment. Now is the moment. This is the decade. This is our last good chance. And that's why it's so urgent that everybody of all ages, of all kinds, figure out how to work together to stand up to the people who don't care about the future and to back those that do, to give them the support that they require. Thank you.
And what a powerful, powerful speech from Bill McKibben. Thank you again, Bill McKibben, for that amazing speech. I think what is so powerful about what he just outlined is the fact that the world really does bend toward justice, right? In the words of Martin Luther King. And I think as we look at the climate crisis and the impacts that climate change is already having on the world, I mean, the climate crisis really when we say crisis, I don't think that's something that should be taken lightly. We're already seeing the impacts of this crisis across the world. Even for me right now, I'm in my home of Long Island, and a few years back from Hurricane Sandy, we saw devastating impacts. There was damage even to my own property. Even a few months back, we had a huge storm that took power out from my home for a few days. The climate crisis is real, and we're seeing these impacts growing more and more, both here in the United States and across the world. I can say for my South Asian family, and that entire community, that we've seen monsoons becoming more intense. We've been seeing more droughts. We've been seeing air pollution taking more and more lives. It's really hard to stress how important the climate crisis is, and just what exactly it's having across the world. And what Bill McKibben even further said was how the climate crisis isn't just a one-day fix kind of thing. It really is the type of thing where we need a series of solutions that build on each other. Because the reality is, this is such an intersectional issue. Climate change is a jobs issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a water issue. It's a food and agriculture issue. It's such an intersectional thing that I'm really excited that we're able to bring this awesome panel and these awesome events today with OneUpAction for everybody at home watching. OneUpAction is an organization that really centers youth voices and people of color in fighting the climate crisis. So if you are able to, please make a donation to OneUpAction.org. You can make it at OneUpAction.org, and that link is probably in the description wherever you're watching this as well. So please, if you can, make a donation, because it really enables the work of the young leaders of OneUpAction to be able to continue to make this difference across the United States and across the world, really. As we've been seeing, recently, the reality is we really need to invest in leaders, in organizers, in activists, and to make sure that we enable change to keep on happening. So please visit oneupaction.org to make a donation. I'm super excited because our next panel is going to focus on environmental justice. And this is for our event today, for our Actions for the Earth Symposium. This environmental justice panel is really going to focus on Biden's American Jobs Plan. And what's really exciting about this is we're really seeing this legislation being actively developed, right? We have the American Jobs Plan, and we have a series of other legislations that are going to be coming out right now. So our panel right now features some incredible young activists and organizers, and is going to focus on clean water. We know that clean water is an issue for climate justice. We see communities of color most often having the least access to clean water, and we see corporations continuing to pollute clean and natural resources, especially in the Black and Brown communities. So the first topic we'll be talking about is clean water. We'll further go into broadband access. We know that broadband internet is essential. Y'all are watching this online right now from your homes, a la COVID. And I think the COVID crisis has really outlined and made clear a lot of disparities across the United States and across the world. And without quality broadband access, without quality internet, it's hard to get an education. And right now it's hard to be connected to anything as we stay at home. So this panel will be talking about broadband access. We'll further delve into job creation. Climate change, climate justice is a jobs issue. As we develop clean energy, there's going to be tons and tons of jobs that we need to develop. This panel is also going to cover restoring our nature-based infrastructure. The best solutions to nature, to the climate crisis, are often in nature. And so the more nature-based solutions we can have, the more improvements we can make to the world. And, nature is really what we're trying to serve through all of this. And cleaning up toxic waste infrastructure, which again, most often is impacting Black and Brown communities. And so each of these is going to especially cover the impacts on low income and otherwise disadvantaged communities. And so I'm really excited for our climate justice panel. Hope y'all are ready for our climate justice panel now.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Justice section of the Actions for the Earth Symposium. I'm Kevin, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Executive Director at OneUpAction International, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. We'll be covering Biden's plans regarding access to clean water, job creation, nature-based infrastructure, toxic waste, and more. We have an amazing array of speakers for you today, but I'll let them speak for themselves. So can we go around and give a quick intro?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be in the space. My name is Kiana Kazemi. I use she, her pronouns. I am calling from UC Berkeley, which is on Ohlone land. And I am an intersectional engineer and environmental justice advocate. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. Shie, do you mind introducing yourself?
Of course. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Shia Bastida, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm currently in New York, which is Lenape land, and I'm originally from Mexico. And I am a climate justice activist and co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative.
Amazing. Wawa, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hey friends, my name is Wawa Guerrero and I am based in the United Kingdom in Oxford, and I am an environmental justice advocate, student, and daughter and friend. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to share this virtual stage with y'all.
And last but not least, Elsa, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Elsa Mengistu. I'm a social impact strategist. I mainly focus on Black environmentalism with a critical focus on Black women and Black youth, and I'm very excited to have a discussion with you guys today.
Well, there you have it, our amazing array of speakers. Now let's get into the conversation with our first question. Why is it important for policy tracking climate change to address justice and equity issues? Explain how these topics intersect.
Mainly, I think we need to name that not only do these issues intersect, but these social issues they are the vacuum in which everything exists. And so if we are creating climate policy or we are tracking climate change, but we are leaving out social issues and we are missing about 75% of the issue, because at the end of the day, climate change impacts people. This earth has been here long before us. This earth will be here long after us. But what will not be here are the communities that are being devastated by climate change disproportionately currently right now and will continue to be down the road. And so if we are creating climate policy and we are sidelining issues that are very important to the conversation and to the issues that we are tackling, then we are leaving out communities that are trying to tackle climate change themselves. And so not only do they intersect, but social issues must be the lens in which we address any type of policy or create policy to begin with.
So like Elsa said, social justice must be the lens that we solve the climate crisis, because social injustice is the reason why we came to the climate crisis in the first place. So in order to solve any problem, we have to understand and dissect the conditions that have led us here. When we think of the Industrial Revolution, we have to understand that it didn't pay for itself. It was subsidized by blood money and blood money of slaves. So when we take a look back into the 1800s and 1860s, particularly, we understand that slaves and their monetary worth was more than manufacturing and railroads put together. And that is not even adding in the monetary worth of the crop that they were developing. So when we made a transition from exploiting people and the land to exploiting the land, we experienced an unjust transition. Right now, we have to make sure that we're experiencing a just transition and making sure that our policies not only understand that climate crisis is exacerbating natural processes, but is also exacerbating the social ills that got us here in the first place. So we have to have plans and policies that really encompass the scale and scope of the climate crisis, not only from a natural lens, but in a social one as well.
So when we talk about addressing climate injustices and climate change, we can't solve that issue if we don't look deeper and really address, those bigger systemic problems, because these issues don't just intersect. Social justice doesn't just intersect with climate change. It actually is the root of it. And so we can't solve climate change if we don't address social injustices.
Amazing. Shay, do you want to add to that question, this discussion?
Yeah, of course. And I think that all of the points that have been brought up are really important. And I think that the only thing I can add to that is really making sure that people know that, our communities have been set as disposable. All of the injustices that are plaguing Black and Brown communities right now and Indigenous communities, they're not incidental. All of the systemic injustices that come from a mentality of extractivism and colonialism and white supremacy are resulting in extractivist industries that are exploiting our land and our people. And so when you look at the effects of the climate crisis, that's what people usually think of when we think about climate change, floods and fires. Those are affecting frontline communities. But when we go back and think about what systems are perpetuating the climate crisis, I mean, pipelines, the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry as a whole, mining companies, all of these industries go to Black and Brown communities primarily. And so our communities are not only being affected by the effects of the climate crisis, but also by the perpetuators. So we are in a mix of not only instability, but also of pollution and health issues. And that's why a policy that recognizes all of these intersectionalities needs to be put forward, because at the end of the day, climate justice is social justice, like has been said by all of the panelists here today. And we cannot address that unless we recognize that the seed of the climate injustice that we are seeing is coupled with all of these systems that are already affecting communities, already making us sick, and already making us be in the front line of an issue that people are saying is going to happen in 50 or 100 years, when in reality it's here already and our communities are dealing with it.
So with all of this being said, do you guys think that Biden's plan adequately addresses the widespread environmental injustice we see across the US? What do you think can be improved? Anyone can just jump in and talk about it.
I was just gonna say, and this is just for the foundation of our conversation, which is when I first read Biden's plan, it talked a lot about competition with China. It talked a lot about the US has to be the #1 country. It talked about, putting people into the middle class. And all of that just, to me, says, I don't want to cooperate, I still want to compete. And we know that the thinking that got us into the climate crisis is that thinking of competition and kind of, I want to be better than you and I want to have more land than you. And that thinking is not going to get us out of the crisis, right? It's a thinking of cooperation that's going to get us out of that. So I actually think that the framework of the Biden plan is not strong enough when it comes to intersectional good solutions that actually take, our framework as youth climate activists into consideration. Because I know that we have built our own organizations to be collaborative. And I have seen, very little competition. There's like no competition among youth climate organizations, and just, this need for collaboration. And we're not seeing that reflected in the federal government or internationally. So I think that, beyond actually looking at the policy, just the foundation of it is still not good enough for me.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that point. I think looking at foundations, what's really important too is the language that's used. So even just looking at the language of the plan, I think, yes, it's really great to talk about justice and justice-oriented language. But, what are mentions of our communities? Our solutions not only have to be collaborative, but they have to be community-oriented, because like she has said before, it's our communities that are at the front lines of these injustices. It's Black and Brown communities that are facing these issues predominantly. And it's also those communities that have the solutions, that have been practicing Indigenous knowledge and practices for, all of this time, and have those solutions. And this plan doesn't center that. This plan doesn't highlight that. And even just looking at the language, if these topics and frameworks don't exist in there, then I don't even think it's going to work at all, because it doesn't consider what's at the root of this problem, which is community oriented.
Yes. To add on to what both of you guys said, essentially, truly, I believe that no policy that Biden can put forth will comprehensively solve environmental injustices or climate change, because we're not at the magnitude of which we need. Joe Biden's entire thing is returning to normal, is normalcy, is working with both sides of the aisle. And while that's idealistic, it's not matching up with reality. Normal is what got us into this position. The last 4 years were abnormal. They were just simply a reflection put in our faces that we could not ignore anymore. But currently, returning to normal is exactly what got us into this place. Normal is privatizing water. Normal is pipelines. Normal is pushing off emission deadlines by 5-10 years because we have time. Normal is sacrificing indigenous communities. Normal is going into African communities and colonizing them for their resources. That is normal. Normal is not going to get us out of this problem. Creating policy that is framed around competition or economic growth is also not going to get us out of this. Economic growth to the point of no end is what has got us into this position in the first place. And so without a true acknowledgement of what normal is and the systems that we are perpetuating, no policy put forth is going to match the magnitude or the intensity of the solutions that we need, simply because we're running away from the problem. We want to go back to normal. Normal is not here. Normal is never here. Normal is gone. We have to move beyond that. And it's very frustrating to see that reflected in our policy instead of the reality that all of us are grappling with every single day.
100%. How about you, Wawa? Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat everything that everyone already said, but I'm in full agreement. Looking at the developments that have been made in the past 4-8 years, I think one of the most important things we have to say is that we're at a point where there is a jobs plan that is, to a degree, not to the scale and scope that's necessary to really address this problem, that is integrating climate within its framework. And that wasn't done because Biden said that it needed to be done. That was done because youth organizers and grassroots organizers rallied on the streets, occupied offices, and forced their politicians to take note. So the fact that we're here in the first place says more about the movement that we're a part of than it does about any personal initiative done by any politician out there. That said, I will say, right, if we look at the plans that have been done in the past 4 years, we are moving into a new presidency that is beginning and taking a step forward. Is that step as broad as it needs to be? No, I think, right, there are parts of the plan, right, and promising that these jobs are going to provide 100% universal clean water to every single person in the country. I mean, that should have already been something that was integrated within the framework of this country. But the fact that we're saying that that is something that we want to accomplish, that's a good step forward. However, it's also important to note that this $2 trillion that is promised to be, put into this plan was promised on a different time scale during the campaign trail. We were told, youth activists, climate folks were told that this was going to happen over 4 years. And now we're seeing that this plan is saying that the $2 trillion are going to be invested from anywhere between 8 to 10 years. And that's just how it is at the moment. That can change in the future. Also, with things like the Civilian Climate Corps, there was a lot of ambiguity on the campaign trail. And yes, right now there is a lot of, this plan says that it's going to provide 10,000 to 20,000 jobs for people in this climate corps. And this climate corps was made to look very similar to the one that was deployed during FDR's presidency. However, again, this climate corps is great in theory, but in scale and scope isn't really encompassing what it needs to do. In the past, when FDR was president, the climate corps, or it wasn't called the climate corps, but the program that this is being mirrored after, actually employed around 300,000 people. And that was at a time when the United States is 40% less of its current size. So not only is it not in scale and scope of the program that it's meant to replicate, but it's not in scale of scope of the unemployment that our country is seeing and that is being exacerbated by the climate crisis. So what I mean is that I think this plan is a step in the right direction, especially looking at the past. Is it to the scale and scope that it needs to be? No, I think that this should be a way for politicians to create more policies and more plans that are moving into the direction of a Green New Deal and isn't one that people just pat themselves on the back and say that we're done creating policies that are oriented around climate justice, because it simply doesn't do what it needs to do.
100%. And I think we already touched on this, but can we all comment on the language around transitioning workers and job creation? How do you all feel about Biden combining aspects of his economic and climate plans? I know some of you guys already touched on that, but if you guys can, go into it.
Well, what I was going to say about Biden's just transition plan is that it's very tricky, to tell somebody who has been doing a job for their entire life to tell them to stop doing their job. And, in the US, we have around 50,000 coal miners. And at this point, I think we have around 250,000 workers in the renewable energy sector. So we're already, outnumbering the number of coal miners, but that's still 50,000 families who have an income, who need to sustain their livelihood, and who, have fallen in this, like all of us, in this system of capitalism that requires us to have a job in order to survive, right? We're not thriving, we're surviving. And when I see some of Biden's plans, especially the amount of money that he is putting into some of his policies, like 85 billion for transportation, or these are really big numbers. And I actually made this calculation in my physics class. But the amount of money that you need to pay all of existing coal workers, $50,000 for 5 years, is $2.5 billion. So we could actually subsidize all of these coal workers so that they don't have to scramble for a new job that they have no experience in. And those are the type of solutions we should be talking about. Sadly, we have to ask people to leave their jobs behind, because we need to transition to a more environmentally friendly economy. But that doesn't mean that we cannot support them. That doesn't mean that we cannot give them, pay them for the work that they are not going to be doing any longer. And $2.5 billion is nothing compared to the US budget. And so I think that those are the types of solutions that we need to be looking at now, when we need to stop drilling for fossil fuels right now. We need to stop burning coal. Our energy grid is too reliant on natural gas and coal, and I think it's about less than 5% renewable energy. And that's not a point where we should be right now. So that's my point of view on just transition. Some things are a lot easier than they sound, and they make it be.
Yeah, I think it totally goes back to, again, about the approach being very economy centric. It might not make sense in an economic framework to just give people $2.5 billion. But when you put people at the forefront of your solutions, when you think about the well-being of people, their happiness, their ability to be with their family, and really be able to go back into education and really relearn a lot of skills. It's not easy to go from a job that you've been doing your entire life to something completely new. And so we need to put human beings at the forefront of our solutions and our policies, and really think, again, from that community-centric place, and think about not even just think about what these communities need, but really amplify the communities at the forefront and bring them into the decision making. If we don't do that, we're not taking that social justice approach to our policies. And again, it just goes back to, who are we centering in our work when we are writing these policies, when we're putting them out into the world and advocating for them.
Yeah, I'll add something really quickly. So to be honest, most of my issues have less to do with the language, but again, into the overall amount of money that is being put towards job creation. So like she was talking about before, the numbers of the entire plan itself isn't doing what it needs to do. She isn't giving what she needs to give in regards to actually making sure that folks that are having jobs in industries that are being phased out are being adequately supported. Yes, this plan is going to provide people the opportunity to join the dislocated workers program. But again, the funds that are being funneled into this program aren't enough to be able to ensure that everyone is included. And that's something that we really need to think about as well. So when you go back to the language aspects and the specific sectors that are being supported in these job creation programs, I think there needs to be more sovereignty on the behalf of communities, especially marginalized communities, to determine for themselves what type of professions within their communities are going to be best supporting them in the face of the climate crisis. I think sometimes they can be a bit too siloed in regards to just focusing on clean energy or, the very conventional occupations that would fall under, say, the civilian climate corps. I think when it comes to providing citizens sovereignty, autonomy to be able to determine what their communities need in the face of the climate crisis, there needs to be more autonomy on supporting other things that are impacting their community. Because like we said, the climate crisis is not just the exasperation of a natural process, it's actually the exasperation of other social ills. So providing funding and support to other programs that are supporting these communities is also something that should be perhaps integrated in the future. I think other climate plans or plans that say that they want to be foundational or fundamentally invested in climate justice, they need to imagine a little bit more of what it looks like to support climate injustice or to support folks that are at the forefront of the climate crisis.
I just truly want to emphasize everything all of you guys said, but mainly the part about a community conscious and centered transition to these jobs. I think one element that we often miss out on is culture when we do talk about things like this. When we talk about coal miners in West Virginia, these people's livelihoods are part of the fabric of the way that they live. It's the generations back. And this is just one specific example of a community. But it is part of their pride and their livelihood going back generations that they are coal miners. And there are communities of color and other communities that whose livelihoods and whose families have done these jobs that we want to get rid of, but it does not address the cultural ties or the cultural shift that we also need to be working on. So people are, okay, this is what we need, X, Y, and Z, and this is how we're going to do it, rather than coming in and say, we're going to transition from these jobs we can be community conscious in the way that we do it, but without addressing culture and the way that people are tied to the way things are currently are done within their communities, we will be leaving people behind.
Thank you all for all your answers. Our next question is, do you believe that Biden's plan to improve our water infrastructure does enough to prevent situations like the Flint, Michigan water crisis for the future? Do you guys believe that? Anyone can get started.
I'd like to start it off. In short, no, the plan is ambitious and it is a great one. But I'd like to point out while Flint, Michigan was drowning in, not drowning, but while Flint, Michigan was suffering from water that they could not use, miles down the road, Nestle was bottling water for free. They pay a $200 a year administration fee to bottle water. They have over 52 brands of water bottles that they sell, and they make billions of dollars just from their water that they package for free. And so if we want to remove lead pipes, if we want to make sure that people have healthy access to water, if we want to make sure that water is universal, then we need to start with universalizing water. Why is water privatized? We need water to survive. Why is the quality of air or the chemicals that you have in your water determined by your zip code or how much money you have in your bank account? That doesn't make sense. Why is it you go to Walmart and you have to compete to get water bottles in times of crises? It doesn't make sense, truly. I'm confused, does someone have the answer? And so if we have a crisis going on and people within their hometowns can't even go, you have to go to the store and buy water that companies are packaging for free. That's the problem right there. Why are we privatizing something that you need to survive? You can't go without water for about 2 days, 1 day.
I think you're definitely right. I think water infrastructure is really, really important. If our infrastructure isn't in place, that's the basic. We can't give access to everyone to good quality water if we don't have the infrastructure. But when we talk about environmental racism and situations like Flint, at the core of that, everyone in power knew what was happening. It was an active decision, a racist decision, to not do anything about it and to continue that environmental harm. So if we want to, stop situations like Flint from happening, we need to yes, have our water infrastructure, but we also need to address environmental racism and the decision-making that's happening in these high up places. Because infrastructure is one thing, but then who is actually making these decisions? What values do they have? Do they care about profit, or do they care about people and human beings and their access to a very, very basic need? So that's just what I have to say about that.
Yeah, just to echo that, Flint was many things. Flint was negligence, to be honest, at the forefront. Those are politicians that couldn't give less of a care about the communities that they were meant to serve. So I guess it's a bit of a swerve from talking about Biden's plan, but it really just shows you the importance of having community members that are invested within their community, invested in galvanizing community power to be in office, as well as dismantling all of the gatekeeping that exists in decision making at large, but particularly in environmental decision making. It's rarely frontline communities that are able to have the political or social capital to be able to stand against their politicians, many of whom oftentimes don't represent them or live in their districts. And that's something that definitely needs to change. I will say with this plan, Biden's plan does call on the elimination of all lead pipes and service lines, which is really, really important. But again, I think this is an example of just showing how, for instance, if you look at the climate crisis as a broad problem, oftentimes people want to silo it as this technical problem that could be solved by science in and of itself. But an issue like Flint, Michigan, where the issue still exists there, that just shows you that even if, right, we were to eliminate all the lead pipes and service lines everywhere in the country, environmental injustice would still exist based off of the systems that uplift a few in power and consistently disenfranchise the folks that have to live with those decisions that are often made based off of saving money, which is exactly what happened. I believe that the city switched its this water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint River, which had been said to have been on fire like 3 times before they even did that. So the research was there, the science was there, but the social implications that people decided to put themselves into, or the politicians decided to put communities into, just shows you that we really, really need to have a deep assessment in this country, particularly in the way that white supremacy continues to disenfranchise Black communities.
Of course. And Shea, do you want to add to this conversation, or should I move on to the next question?
I'll just add something really quickly, which is that, around this whole conversation, we're still calling water a resource, right? We're calling just the language that we use in that respect is still harmful. Because, water is part of life. We don't have water, we literally don't have anything. And we're still in this mentality of what our resources are, when in reality, they should be celebrated as part of life. And, I'm half Chilean, and in Chile, water is privatized. And you can really see the effects that has on communities. Communities don't have access to water if they don't pay for it. Their crops are drying up. It's, taking culture and tradition away from people who are dependent on just water sources that are naturally there. So the Biden plan for me, which, is costing $111 billion to just replace lead pipes, which, as Wawa said, is really important, but it's just such a small step to actually making sure that communities have safe drinking water. Because, pollutants come from factories. Pollutants come from spillovers of pipelines. Like, all of this pollution comes from acid rain. It comes from a lot of different places, not just what the pipelines are made of. And, I just think that if you're going to spend $111 billion in water infrastructure, it cannot just be 1 or 2 points. It has to be a holistic approach to, ensuring that communities have healthy water that is democratized, that it's not owned by any one company, that people are not profiting off of that.
And the last thing I'll add on that, a lot of people don't know this, but the EPA doesn't regulate private wells. So there are folks that are experiencing the aftermath or the active continuance of having their water supplies being impacted by neighboring companies or corporations, and may not adequately have the testing supplies to check if something's going wrong. And I think in an instance like this is an opportunity with the Biden administration saying that they care about having access to clean water for everyone, to take a look at the policies that exist and make sure that the EPA can regulate private wells and provide guidance for folks, because this also disenfranchises folks in rural areas that don't have access to public water.
Amazing. I'm gonna go into the last two questions. I think Biden has devoted $10 billion to expanding broadband access across the nation, and especially to underserved areas and communities. So, what are your thoughts on Biden's plan to redevelop infrastructure in disadvantaged communities?
Well, I'll just start by saying that, COVID has shown us that you really cannot live without being connected to internet. You can't, put your ideas out there, be part of a community, especially in times where we are going to be facing more and more crises as the climate crisis worsens, because this is not going to be our first pandemic in our lifetime. It's not going to be the first time we have to stay inside because of air pollution or wildfires or floods. Like, we need a way to stay connected, and a strong infrastructure that ensures that people have access to internet is kind of becoming a human right at this point. And I think COVID really is a very, very prime example of that. So I actually think this is a really great plan. But I think it has to be coupled with, where not only where this, open internet access is available, because, for example, in New York City, you have open Wi-Fi in subways and, in the street where there's this Wi-Fi port, Wi-Fi things that are just in the middle of the street. But I cannot sit down and do my work in the subway station or in the middle of the street. I can't join a call or a panel or, or do school through any of those. So I think there needs to be community centers that come with these Wi-Fi infrastructure. People really have to think about it, as students or workers, how are we actually gonna make the best out of this plan specifically?
I mean, this is long overdue. I think investing back within communities is just the right thing to do, but also communities have failing infrastructure, and I'm particularly talking about marginalized communities, because of redlining and racist policies. So our politicians in the past, and even continue to this day, exasperate and make sure that those policies still exist, to basically redline communities of color and make sure that they experience failing infrastructure. So I mean, it's a great step. It should have happened a long time ago. I also think that the percentage of the funds that are being invested back into communities of color and marginalized communities isn't enough. I almost think that it should be over 50%. Actually, I know it should be over 50%. And I think this is an opportunity, again, not only to reintegrate a reparations mindset, but a climate reparations mindset in this country. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is not the first time that I think that communities of color and marginalized communities should get some sort of financial support in regards to the failing infrastructure that they themselves didn't choose to be subjected to.
Now that we have discussed, Biden's Build Back Better plan and really the aspects around Biden's Build Back Better plan, I really want to ask you guys, what action should Biden really take so that we can really have an adequate plan that addresses the injustices that are happening within our communities, within marginalized communities, right? We've discussed that his plan is not meeting the mark for our communities, and in some areas it is. But what do you guys think that he needs to do to really make his plan solid?
I would say keep the plans coming. This cannot be the first plan. Something that worries me is that oftentimes, right, especially when you're a president in your first term or just in a term in general, you want to just put a check mark on all these different things that you were able to accomplish. But we need nuance with this problem. We need nuance in the scale and scope and the way that we're addressing it. And like I said before, this is a plan as it is before other people try to take away parts of the plan. So this is like the best version. And the fact that we have so many critiques and different things that we as youth advocates, all of us can go, I don't know, but as youth advocates that aren't in elected office can make, that tells us that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I would say, President Biden, keep on coming. We're going to stay on the streets. We're going to keep pushing y'all forward. And also, I think in general, I think we need to abolish the filibuster because that's something that I see as something that might be a huge problem when this is introduced.
I say keep the plans coming, but also get the action going because we don't just need plans, we also need action. We need you to actually make these things happen, you know? A lot of the infrastructure plans in this are really important, and we need to actually make it happen. So if that's with the support of youth activists and organizers and grassroots communities, you know, if our inputs are in there and if our voices are centered, then we're going to push for this to happen. And we just want the same level of like urgency to come from our government. So we want action and we want it now, and we want really progressive and really hopeful action. And we need to make it happen. So we are here to support you if you're listening. But only if our voices are centered and if our experiences are listened to and really integrated into these policies.
Yeah, both of you guys summed it up really well, but essentially moving beyond build back better, but think smarter, big builder. There's so much more we have to do before we can even have a moment's rest of breath. But mainly, I think we need a way for people, communities to have formal grievances about what is going on in their communities and having formal ways of that being addressed by the US government. And so we are actively and proactively centering the communities that we do want to target with these bills. But other than that, keep the bills coming, keep the policies coming, because this is the first and this is definitely not the last, because we're just going to be in the streets, or we're like, you do not, I mean, we got this bill because we were on Joe Biden. Like, trust me, none of this comes easy. Like, people fight for this. People go to war for this. Like, people go to war for oil. Like, we are so dependent on natural resources that are killing us. Like, it is going to take a tremendous shift in culture and conscience and society for us to implement the plans that we need. And so for Biden, we need him to think larger. We need him to go large scale on the magnitude that we need. And so that begins with formal grievances and systems to center our communities, and then to actually address them on the scale that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can add anything to like what you guys said. It was so powerful. But yeah, you know, well, like Wawa said, the plan's coming, like Yana said, the action going, like Elsa said, you know, make it intersectional, make sure that communities are getting money. And the only thing I can add is that not for the sake of efficiency are we gonna let you do things the patriarchal way, the racist way, the misogynistic way. Like, we need things fast, and we're here to put that pressure as youth activists, but you have enough people to make smart decisions, to make the right decisions. So we're not gonna let things be done in a way that harms our communities. Because we are asking for this to be done in a fast way. We have 7 years to have our carbon emissions, but it needs to be done thoughtfully. It needs to be done intersectionally and intergenerationally. So yeah, and you know, we can do it because we're here and we have the people power and the science to back all of our plans.
You are all right. You know, we have 7 years left to really reverse the effects of climate change. And I will say Biden's plan is not enough. We need to continue, right? Continue with the plans, continue with the action. It has to be both intersectionally and it has to be both intergenerational, right? And so that we're able to stop these injustices, these inequalities and disparities that are happening to our communities. With that being said, I just want to thank everyone that has joined us so far for the environmental justice section of the Actions for the Earth Symposium. And I want to thank the panelists for taking their time out of their day to talk to us about, you know, their thoughts on the Biden Build Back Better plan. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and stay tuned.
That was so powerful. And I think one of the biggest things from that panel that I hope you saw is just how intelligent and capable and brilliant and awesome young people are, not only in terms of the activism that they have on the ground across this country, leading marches and protests and climate strikes, but also to really sit down and delve into large scale policy, analyze it, criticize it, digest it, suggest even changes to that policy. I think what we just saw on this panel of environmental justice was really how much young people can contribute to this conversation, particularly people of color and people from disenfranchised communities. I want to highlight, Wawa was saying how we can't just go back to normal. We really need to understand the urgency of the climate crisis, and we really need to keep going. Jie was saying that, we need a just transition. We can't just simply move on to a different world. We need to make sure that no one is being left behind, that from the coal workers to the people of color to the indigenous people, that everyone is looked after for in these plans. And what kind of we overall saw was that we need to continue to build up ambition, and we need to continue to build up action. In particular, we need to make sure that our water resources are protected. We can't just be abusing the water that we have across this country. Water really is a human right. And so if you want to take action, you can actually go to support this petition from the Food and Water Watch. It should be in the chat right now, and you can also find it at OneUpAction.org. This petition on the Water Act urges members of Congress to support the Water Act and to really build up, rebuild, and invest in our water infrastructure. We often hear a lot of focus on Flint. We just heard a lot about Flint in this panel as well. I want everyone watching to be cognizant of the fact that there isn't just one Flint. There are Flints all across America, different communities that have lead in their water and other chemical pollutants that are damaging their health on a daily basis right now. And so while we often focus on Flint, there are so many communities that need their water infrastructure rebuilt. And the Water Act is a really important way that we can invest in our water infrastructure right now. So please support the water petition, which you can find in the chat and also on oneupaction.org, ONE. Next, we have an awesome panel on transportation, right? So transportation, obviously super important. We got to get to where we're going. We are where we are. We need to be places. Transportation it's cars, it's roads, it's highways, it is boats, it is airplanes, it is trains, and we really want to highlight how important infrastructure on transportation is. And in particular, at today's Actions for the Earth Symposium, we're going to be focusing on Joe Biden's part on transportation in the American Jobs Plan. Obviously, revamping our transportation infrastructure is going to create tons of jobs, but it really needs to be done in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way that ensures that we're able to meet the goals of the Paris Accord and to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. That's less than a decade at this point. Time is a ticking. And so this panel will focus on rebuilding transportation infrastructure, public transport, investing in rail services like Amtrak, and so many things are going to be in this panel about addressing transportation infrastructure. So get ready for this incredible discussion on transportation infrastructure brought to you today from the Action for the Earth Symposium from OneUpAction.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the transportation section of the Actions for the Earth Symposium. I'm Bailey, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm Director of Chapter Relations here at OneUpAction International, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. We'll be covering Biden's plans regarding rebuilding transportation infrastructure, public transit, and investment in rail service and Amtrak as outlined in the American Jobs Plan. We have an awesome array of speakers for you today, but I'll let them speak for themselves. So can we go around and do a quick intro?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Isaiah Hernandez. I am an environmental educator and creator of Career Brown Vegan. I use he, they pronouns and currently residing on Lenape Land, greater New York City area. As an environmental educator, I create various forms of introductory topics of environmentalism that ranges from colorful graphics, visual illustrations, and video storytelling.
Hi everyone, my name's Christy Drutman. I use she, her pronouns, and I reside on Ohlone land, otherwise known as the Bay Area. I am the host and founder of Brown Girl Green, which is a podcast and media series where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about diversity and inclusion and equity, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. I'm so excited to be here today for this discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Zanaji Artist. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently on Narragansett land here in Providence, Rhode Island. I am a founder and the policy director of Zero Hour, a youth-led climate justice organization, and I'm also the author of a kid's book about climate change. I'm so excited to talk to you all today.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet all of you guys, and we're so grateful you guys could join for this panel today. So let's just hop into these questions about transportation. Our first question is, why is transportation an important part of climate policy? And anyone can take it.
I can jump in. So I think that transportation is such a key part of climate policy because of its contributions to emissions in the US. It is the leading emissions sector in the US with 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. And transportation is key to everything in the US economy. It's the movement of people and goods. And that's why we must transition transportation and why it's key to climate, because the amount of energy that's consumed by transportation every day.
Amazing. I wanted to add on to that by saying that the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations, talk specifically about transportation, and that transportation agencies such as metropolitan planning organizations and state departments of transportation need to conduct analyses to determine if the transportation infrastructure that they're developing will or will not negatively impact low-income communities and communities of color. And so I think that this conversation is really important when we're talking about climate justice, because if we don't have folks who are going to have access to healthy, clean transportation, then we're going to continue to see inequities around who gets access to clean transport and who doesn't. So I think that this is a really important discussion around reducing emissions and also about equitable access to green space and to proper infrastructure to be in a livable, thriving city in today's modern world.
Thank you so much for that. Isaiah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna add this like tiny bit part is that it is a lead contributor to our climate emissions, especially in greenhouse specifically. And so I think that when we talk about transportation, we don't just always think about technological improvements, but also looking at the existing infrastructure that has economically suppressed many communities, especially when it comes to looking into freeways and the legacy of environmental racism behind that. So I think it's super important that when trying to find these solutions, especially with policy, that we actually look back into history to acknowledge a lot of the injustices that have happened to these communities.
Definitely. I think what you guys said was all right on topic. I think, people often think of transportation as something that could be boring or just a little part of Biden's plan, but they don't actually realize the environmental justice impacts that it can have. So on that same note, do you believe that Biden's transportation policy adequately addresses the magnitude of the carbon emissions from the transportation sector, like what Christy and Sanaji said already? And what do you think could be improved about Biden's plan?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I think that it's a great acknowledgement to see the government realize the urgency. However, I don't think it's the end all be all situation, mainly because it's a electrical transition. But in reality, we know that it would just be outsourcing different types of natural resources that are not infinite in this planet. And so for me, what I see as truly sustainable is walking and biking as very sustainable forms, although that's not really accessible for many people. And so I think that when trying to propose this idea of limiting emissions, I think there's also this acknowledgement that we're trying to expect this large, massive GDP growth system that is still a bit unsustainable. And so I think that with lowering our carbon emissions, it also means slowing down our economy, but in a system that is designed to always grow and think about increasing in its GDP growth. It almost seems as if it's a tug of war a bit for both sides.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that. I mean, the plan is indicating that there's going to be an investment around like $620 billion to improve infrastructure, which is amazing. Like, we have not had that kind of investment like in any recent history. And we have crumbling public infrastructure. We have so much inequitable access, especially for low-income communities, to have access to things like grocery stores and have access to public parks or nature or, you know, livable, breathable spaces. And so having access to transportation is going to improve jobs access. It's going to maybe make certain areas that have been traditionally polluted over the past few decades actually, you know, reduce their emissions, reduce the air pollution that communities of color have to be exposed to on a consistent basis. So I think it's really positive, and I'm really excited that there is such an investment in this, because there's going to be so much systemic ripple effects that come out of it. But when it comes to implementing that infrastructure, I would like to know, how is this administration actually consulting communities on the ground? Like has there been consultation on how this is going to be built? Who's going to get access to those jobs? Who has a say in where that infrastructure is built? Because certain jobs are going to be, you know, or businesses are going to be able to benefit from the transportation, and having your businesses built along transportation routes. So who gets access to that and who doesn't? Is the cost of housing going to go up in those areas? Is that going to have ripple impact? So I would like to know, like, how communities are being really kept at the center of this, especially BIPOC communities, to make sure that more inequities don't get replicated with this amazing initiative, which I don't think, you know, that's the intention, but those things are always happening time and time again when a positive solution comes about. But yeah, BIPOC communities don't get to reap the benefits. So that's top of mind for me, that those consultations will be prioritized.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I think that consultation is something that's going to be so important. And really, you're so right that we haven't had an investment of this size in infrastructure in so long that we really need to get this right. And this is our shot to really improve infrastructure in a way that is alongside communities and really does implement environmental justice. And I think that there are a lot of signs in Biden's plan right now that point to a lot of progress on that. But I think there is a lot of lack of clarity on actual on the ground engagement with people. But I really like to see his plan to transition diesel vehicles, to implement electric school buses. He's also committed to transitioning the federal fleet to all electric vehicles, which will also create jobs. But I think there's also a lot more that could be done. He doesn't say anything about, for example, lots of things related to personal vehicles and whether or not he's willing to push private industry to stop producing SUVs or continue to phase out combustion engine vehicles altogether. And so there's lots of things I think that Biden could do even more and use his influence as the president outside of federal ability to act on things as the chief executive.
Definitely. And that's actually a great segue actually into our next topic about electric vehicles and charging stations. So do you think Biden's investment into electric vehicles and charging stations puts an extra emphasis on personal transportation rather than public transportation? And how can Biden increase the popularity of public transportation for all?
I think when it comes to like the public transportation realm, I think it's too acknowledging the fact that many of the freeways, yes, we can talk about the environmental injustice that it caused, but when the building of freeways happened, it devastated and destroyed a lot of Black businesses, especially in Detroit, as an example of this. And so I think that when we talk about public infrastructure and transportation. I think it's also looking into those city policies and practices that have banned a lot of these like public necessities that are needed, such as like the reducing of bus routes happening in certain communities, or the lack of acknowledgement to hire more bus drivers. And so I think that in my view, when I look about investment in public transportation resources, it's about also reinvesting in that community to be able to define their own solutions. And so this also looks into fighting against NIMBYism, because many of the people that are trying to propose these types of development projects in those areas, especially middle and upper middle class areas, they do not want these projects in their communities. They want to continue what you would say not having realm of noises around there. And so I think there's also this like distrust within government systems and within politicians. And so I think in order to improve that, we also have to first start of like who gets to have access to these amenities, because many of the people sometimes are left beyond or already experiencing the legacy of these freeways. So that's all I had to say.
Yeah, so Biden's plan definitely does put a large emphasis on personal vehicles and personal transportation. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that could be concerning, particularly for extraction and the actual manufacturing of electric vehicles, and a market scale buildup that would require extraction from lithium ion batteries to whatever other needs there are for electric motors in these new vehicles. The amount of extraction is hard to scale because it hasn't happened ever before. But we know that that will take place, and that is a strong reason why we should be preferencing transit. And one of the things that I think Biden could do a lot more talking about to actually incentivize people and build public opinion on public transit is integrated systems. And I was really excited to move here to Rhode Island for college because of the RIPTA, which is the Rhode Island Public Transit Authority, which is one of the only statewide public transit systems in the country. So I can get on the bus and travel anywhere in the state. It's great. I've been to the beach and everything, but that isn't the case for most places, and you need to have a car. And so planning around that is something that I think Biden could do a lot more of.
Zanaji, do you think Biden's plan adequately addresses the lack of integrated systems for transit within, America as a whole? Because I know you said your state has it, but many states do not. Do you think Biden's plan addresses that at all, or do you think that needs to be addressed?
I definitely think it needs to be addressed. So Biden talks a lot about the buildup of electric charging stations across the country, and that's really great. But it does prioritize personal vehicles and charging stations for those. Whereas another angle that could be taken is actually investing more in what he's talked about already with transitioning school buses and electric transit, rather than building up infrastructure that will be accessible for personal vehicles.
On that note, I'll just have you guys comment a little bit about Biden's transition to, a more electric fleet for a lot of federal vehicles, including school buses and even mail trucks. So if anyone wants to talk about that subject and kind of, your opinions or your feelings about this.
I mean, I think it's really important. I think it's a part of like making that more systemic change that I think will have like a really big impact. I think it's also like he's getting a lot of flack right now from like, I think everyone across the political aisle, like people on the left and the right. People are just wondering how this is going to actually like be executed or happen. But I think it's important that he's putting it out there and that the vision is there and that he's actually like putting his words into action on like what he's envisioning this new transition to look like. And I think that's really cool because it'll also provide way more jobs, which I think plenty of people can agree is a good thing.
I think it also is a way for many young generations to reimagine the idea of public transportation. And so I think that while it is great to see that these advancements are being made, especially with like mail carriers, buses, it's also really important to acknowledge like they aren't the ones that are really polluting the environment at very fast rates. It's generally, like as mentioned from other panelists, the idea of these like globalized systems that allow us to really partake in this like big food system that is transporting large amounts of food in different areas. And so I think it'd be really great to see this idea of like reweaving the system into a more localized system that serves that state or area, rather than trying to expand it globally within the United States of like you can go here to there to different states, because that then becomes a bit more complex, especially with development. And I think too, there would hopefully be what I would like to say is like transportation reparations for many communities that have like lost their businesses, and reimagining green spaces in those areas. So if they're going to plan to demolish old freeways or old infrastructure that no longer serves those communities or were built in the 1960s, then that the community is able to build a safe way for either transportation to be there or some green space park for children. So that's how I would hope to see that pan out. But of course, that really takes into account of zoning laws and other things.
Definitely agree on that. I think that, yeah, it's such a good point that the federal fleet is only a small slice of the pie for transportation emissions. And I think it's like obviously a really great step for Biden to say that he's going to transition the federal fleet, but there's so much more, whether it's like shipping from actual like ships, commercial shipping, from trucking, like all of that. There's so much more that can be done, and we only have a short window of time to do it. And so those plans definitely need to be coming out because, yeah, we're running out of time.
Definitely. Christy, do you have something to add?
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, just adding on to that, like the timeline is really quick. And I think at the end of the day, even though he's like, signing these executive orders and really pushing it forward, it is also going to be up to like driving the industry to shift and to normalize these things. And it's going to require a culture shift. And, he's going to keep getting more criticism, most likely, for it, because people are like, well, there's a lot of bureaucracy and bottlenecks to actually source these things and make it happen. But right now, I think we need that kind of leadership, even if people think that, your ideas don't make sense. Like, we need that kind of reimagining of what this can look like. So I'm glad that he's at least putting it forward. And I hope that it follows through and people can see the benefits in the long term of these practices.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in again on that, I think that I'm excited to see how his plan will push industry, because I think that in deciding for the federal fleet to electrify, obviously someone's going to have to pick up the contract to do that. And so whether it's General Motors or Ford or whatever American automaker decides to do it, I think that will also push whatever company that is to also continue producing their own electric vehicles. And so that's exciting to see potentially happen. And the federal fleet is around 650,000 cars. And so that's really exciting. And it'll electrify lots of vehicles on the road. And I'm especially excited about postal vehicles because they've been in service for so long. Like the postal vehicles that are on the road now have probably been on the road for the past few decades. And so now to have this opportunity to switch them to electric is really exciting to see.
Definitely. I think all of us are super excited for that. I can't wait to see electric mail trucks driving around my street. I think that'll be so cool when I see the first one. Okay, so a little bit of a segue into our next topic. As you guys mentioned, obviously those federal fleets do not contribute as much emissions as Amtrak and freight and different train systems across the United States. So Biden has proposed spending $80 billion to expand Amtrak service across the nation, and many have criticized the new route because they would run through indigenous reservations. So does anyone want to comment on the impact of these new transportation plans and how they would impact indigenous peoples in America?
Yeah, I would say that it, like I said before, like it comes down to like the consultation with these communities. And it seems like if that's not happening, like, I mean, again, like if you are going to do that, like what, you're going to displace this entire community that's been there for such a long time. And I understand that people may make these arguments of like, oh, we don't have access to land anymore because it's maybe been zoned or like possessed by like other entities. But it's like, you can't do that at the sacrifice of people's livelihoods and communities either. So if indigenous communities don't want it built, then it shouldn't be built there, and they need to figure out where to build it somewhere else. And of course, that's going to lead into more contention on like, well, whose land is allowed to be built on in order, in the name of like economic development, which is a constant discussion when it comes to urban planning, on which communities are going to become, you know, these sacrificial territories in the name of progress. But it's just not going to result in what we want it to result in, especially if these communities have not been consulted and don't actually think that they're going to reap the benefits from that project. I have to look more into like what those critiques and opinions have been, but just from hearing with what you said, I think that if there hasn't been that proper consultation, I'm not here for it.
Yeah, and I think that when who gets to decide, who gets to reimagine the future of a green, just transition, it's super important that we still remain critical of whose ideas are being put at the forefront, because I think that the rhetoric shows that this is such a great idea. These are innovations for the future, but in reality, we often ignore the ecological impacts that actually have been happening. And so this happened too, like I mentioned about freeways, is that many of the communities that were displaced were pushed into subsidized housing or affordable housing units for the rest of their lives. And so they lost their land, they lost their homes, and they lost their businesses. And so in trying to decide of reimagining a green system, who does it actually benefit? Who will actually economically gain capital from this, and who will actually lose? And so I think too, like in terms of just development projects, that we still continue to remain critical of like for who are these services really serving to. And I think to just the long-term impacts of comparing both the train industry and the air flight industry, it's a lot of conversations to unpack. And so I think it'd be very interesting to see what solutions are being at the forefront or being proposed as safer or sustainable types of transportation.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that is, yeah, amazing. And yeah, it's so important to think about who is this really for? And it's great to see Biden is investing these billions of dollars, or has proposed this investment. But also, I mean, I don't know if you all have used Amtrak, but I wouldn't say it's public transit. Amtrak is so expensive. Like, Amtrak is so expensive. And so who is this investment really for if we're going to say we're going to put all this money into building out this rail network and subsidizing Amtrak and all of this effort? And then what if people don't even end up riding it because the people who are regular riders of public transit aren't using these interstate railways? You know, people, I'm from Connecticut, people ride Amtrak to go into New York City. And there are people who are working in Manhattan and they have these high salary jobs. And that's why Amtrak tickets are so high. And so the regular people, you know, everyday people aren't using Amtrak in the way that I think President Biden really thinks that they are. And I think that was a great narrative on the campaign trail to say, like, I'm Joe Biden and I rode the train to Congress all the time. But also, that was like decades ago, and things have changed, Joe. So I think really thinking about, yeah, who this is for and really rooting it in community is something that has to happen.
Thank you for that. I agree with, you know, everything you guys said. So one last question to, you know, close us off. Talking about, you know, consulting communities and this, you know, transition from for the fleet into energized vehicles and the Amtrak. How do you think Biden's plans, once they're actually implemented, will pursue a just transition?
I think, in my view, that within the 4 years, I think it's very limiting, and it's very hard to say the phrase like just transition, because we obviously do not know what the future looks like and what will unfold. So I think it's very important that we not remain critical, but we remain just understanding that the idea of just transition being viewed as a radical idea or this like new idea may be very limiting in ourselves. And so, not to say to put our hopes down, but to be understanding too that within the time frame of how Christy had mentioned, like how policies and bureaucracy operates. At the same time, I would hope that there is economic opportunities for those that have been disadvantaged by the system to be able to transition. But at the same time, I think that these next 4 years are super important in the development stages and the blooming stages of these transitions. And so I think what is to come after those 4 years really depends on who will be in office, how our climate looks like, and what our presidency would look like by then.
Yeah, I think, just building off of what Isaiah was saying, like, again, like with the federal government, it's all about laying a vision and promoting really strong climate leadership that centers a just transition, which was, coined and led specifically by BIPOC climate justice leaders. And it needs to remain that way. There needs to be that consultation on a federal level. But, we're even seeing in states like California, like making really radical, which it's not really radical, but I would say like radical as in comparison to the rest of the country in terms of making this transition towards reducing emissions, towards creating policy to get us there way faster than we need to within the next couple of years, which we need to. It's going to require state and local governments to also be making these changes, to follow federal government, to listen to that leadership, and to also implement it, whether we're thinking about disaster resilience plans, whether we're thinking about local transportation. All of these things are going to also need to happen, especially in cities where this planning and these zoning decisions are happening to decide where this transportation is going to actually live and thrive. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that his administration is laying some really important foundations for this work. But in order for it to be implemented on the scale and the rate that they want it to be, there needs to be leadership at all levels of government, and there needs to be accountability to the communities on the ground that are going to be impacted by this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. This plan that is laid out right now is definitely groundwork, but we have so much further to go on the just transition. What I'm really hopeful about is the jobs aspect of this plan. I think that there's been a lot of criticism for the Biden administration around where jobs are coming from and what that's going to look like. And so transitioning the federal fleet is one opportunity for that. It'll also open lots of opportunities for transitioning the grid, which I think is really great. Talked a lot about transportation and these electric charging stations and all of that, but we can't forget that natural gas powers most of the electric grid. And so even when we transition to electric vehicles, it won't actually be emission free. And so thinking about jobs that will be created from that is exciting, but also want to think about jobs that will be taken away from manufacturing of combustion engine vehicles. And there are people whose families have been working in the motor industry for a really long time, and we also have to ensure that those people get transitioned from building engines to building electric motors, and how is that going to happen? There's lots of hope in the plan, I think, right now from Biden, but there's definitely lots of areas for improvement on just transition and implementing things informed by community.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I think, we'll see in the next 4 years where Biden's plans are actually implemented. And I think, holding all of our local governments and the Biden administration accountable is also super important. I just want to say thank you so much for all of your input and your amazing answers to all of these questions I had today. So thank you guys so much for joining, and that concludes our transportation part of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
That was just so inspiring. I think really getting down into some of the nitty gritty of our transportation system is super important right now. I think Isaiah was talking about this idea of reimagining our transportation system. And I think that's super important, is having that vision of how are we designing our cities? How are we designing our cars, our roads? How are we critically analyzing these systems and changing them in a way that is not just a marginal improvement on what we have, but that really systemically changes everything in a way that can actually get us to half our emissions and carbon by 2030. Christy was talking about this idea of this radical transportation. And I wanted to comment on that because I think we often see this idea that this is radical, that, we're going in and we're trying to radically change the system and make all this chaos. And I think what's really radical is not taking action. What is radical is seeing a pandemic and not trying to provide vaccinations. What's radical is seeing a climate crisis and not trying to reduce our carbon emissions. What's radical is seeing frontline communities and not trying to prioritize environmental justice. This idea of radical, America has always been this place of resilience that has tried, at least in some manner, to put people first and to keep on pushing for something better, a more perfect union. And I think we really need to question this idea of radical and reframe that conversation into really understanding how important it is that we address the climate crisis, because the only radical thing I see is not taking action. And one way that y'all watching can actually take action on this is, to sign on to this petition, which is being dropped on in the chat. This petition is to build back fossil free. So we often hear this conversation about building back better. And we know we need to, not just go back to the way things were before the pandemic, but we need to go better. We need to go bigger. We need to go bolder. We need to build back better. And we also need to build back fossil free. As we're starting to invest trillions of dollars into our economy, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing renewable sources of energy and that we are deprioritizing anything that is going to promote fossil fuels, be that pipelines or any other type of infrastructure that is going to continue to delay our ability to halve our emissions in carbon. And so please sign on to this petition. It should be in the chat. If you have dropped and not, gotten to see that yourself, you can find that petition's link on OneUpAction.org, OneUpAction.org for that petition to build back fossil free. Now, I am very excited about our next segment because, of course, we had keynote speeches. Later on, we have a congressman. We've been seeing some of our amazing panels on environmental justice. Next, we have music, a performance by the singer Corey. Corey is great. Corey is a youth climate activist who really understands this messaging. In addition to, not just singing, she also is a songwriter, an artist, an environmental science student. And Corey has been part of OneUpAction, who is helping and running our amazing symposium today. Corey has also been a member of XR Youth US National, as well as the 0 Hour Music and Art. And so here is a performance by Corey, and I hope you guys enjoy this awesome performance by Corey.
I walked across an empty land. I know the pathway like the back of my hand. I felt the earth beneath my feet. Sat by the river and it made me complete. Oh, simple thing, where have you gone? I'm getting tired and I need someone to rely on. I came across a fallen tree. I felt the branches of it looking at me. Is this the place we used to love? Is this the place that I've been dreaming of? Oh, simple thing, where have you gone? I'm getting old and I need something to rely on. And if you have a minute, why don't we go talk about it somewhere only we know? This can be the end of everything, so why don't we go somewhere only we know? Somewhere only we know. Oh, simple thing, where have you gone? I'm getting old and I need someone to rely on. So tell me when you're gonna let me in. I'm getting tired and I need somewhere to begin. And if you have a minute, why don't we go talk about it somewhere only we know? 'Cause this can be the end of everything, so why don't we go somewhere only we know? Somewhere only we know. Paradise and put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. They took all the trees and put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 to see them. Don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you got till it's gone. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Hey farmer, farmer, put away the DDT now. Give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Late last night, I heard the screen door slam, and a big yellow taxi took away my old man. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? You paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you got till it's gone. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot.
That was such a lovely, lovely performance. Thank you so much, Corey, for that awesome performance. And I really love how environmental themes were weaved into the songs you were singing. I think that it's really important, to talk about why we felt it was important to include a musical performance for our symposium today, our Actions for the Earth symposium today. And that's because I think art and music is so important to any social justice movement. I think art and music can be regenerative and restorative. Art and music are unifying, and they create a literal way for us to harmonize together. And I think for anyone watching who's wondering, how can I take action? How can I get involved? I think art and music are really powerful ways to convey messages on a large way. And whatever it is that you're good at is really important to contribute to a movement. If you're a chef, if you are an artist, if you are someone who's a good public speaker, if you are a musician, a writer, if you're into politics, whatever it is that you're good at, there is a niche and a space for you in every movement and in every space. And so I highly suggest you look inward and look at the skills that you're really good at and what you're passionate about, and find a way that you can contribute those to the climate justice movement. Today, we're here for our incredible Actions for the Earth symposium brought to us by OneUpAction. OneUpAction is an environmental justice organization that's youth-led and is really about mobilizing young people and BIPOC communities to mobilize and take action for the climate crisis. And I think particularly right now, in this time of uncertainty, in this time of a pandemic, in this time where we see a looming climate crisis, in this time where it's the eve of Earth Day is literally tomorrow, it's really important that we do whatever we can to help organize. And right now, OneUpAction is really doing a lot to really mobilize young people, and indeed are bringing us this awesome symposium for the Earth today. And so if you are able, please donate. You can find a donation link in the chat, and you can also go to oneupaction.org to be able to donate as well. So thank you for whatever it is that you're able to contribute. You can also even go to oneupaction.org and find a way to start your own local chapter and to mobilize and organize for the climate crisis. This is such a crucial time that we continue to organize around these issues. And I'm really excited about all the plans that we're seeing from our government to address these issues. Up next, we have an awesome panel that addresses exactly one of these. We see the American Jobs Plan, which is providing a lot of economic opportunity for farmers. And obviously, farming is an essential part of addressing the climate crisis, because our food and conservation systems are tied to not only our health, but also to the climate, to nature. And so when we look at Biden's economic plans for farmers, I think this discussion will be really interesting, because we'll be able to talk about resilient food systems, water, land resources, conservation, and the intersectionality of all of these things, in addition to their impact on farmers and to the communities that are being most impacted by this jobs plan. And I think it'll be really great to be able to explore discussions of regenerative agriculture, where we can find ways of not just simply extracting our resources, but understanding how we can regenerate and conduct our food processes in a way that is more sustainable, more healthy for the planet, and more natural. So here is our amazing panel featuring some amazing young environmental justice activists on food and agriculture and conservation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is the Agriculture and Conservation panel for today. I'm Sarah, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Operations at OneUpAction, and I'll be moderating this conversation. So today we'll be covering Biden's plans regarding resilient food systems, land and water resources, and economic opportunities for farmers. But first, let's meet our panelists. So Abby, could you start us off with an intro?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Abby Katz. I'm a second-year graduate student in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University, and my focus is food policy and history there. And outside of the classroom, I'm also a research assistant in the Department of Population Health on the section on health choice, policy, and evaluation at NYU Langone. Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Storm Lewis, and I'm currently a senior at Smith College, majoring in environmental science and policy with a concentration in sustainable food systems. And so I've done a lot of research with the Corbin Hill Food Project, which is a farm share program based in New York City, along with consulting on climate mitigation strategies for small dairy farms in Hadley, Massachusetts, and really thinking about how can we assess their greenhouse gas emissions. And overall, I'm really passionate about increasing not just food security, but access to culturally appropriate foods and increasing community ownership over those food systems through food sovereignty efforts.
I'm Mackenzie Feldman. I'm the Executive Director of Herbicide-Free Campus, and we work with students around the country to eliminate the spraying of herbicides at schools. And I'm also a food research fellow for the think tank Data for Progress, where I write food and agriculture memos and policies on topics related to protecting farm workers and increasing land access for beginning and disadvantaged farmers.
Hello, my name is Lana Waigana. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a climate activist who focuses on the impact of food systems on the climate crisis. I'm Deputy Partnerships Director of 0 Hour, which is a youth-led climate justice organization, and I also serve as the Vice Chair of Shifting to Sustainable Consumption Patterns for the UN Food Systems Summit 2021.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And I'm really excited to have you all here. To start off our conversation, could you guys explain your views on why talking about agriculture and food systems is essential to conversations about the climate crisis, just how those issues intersect?
Happy to get us started with a few facts. First, our food system contributes to over 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It has also been shown that it will not be possible to combat the climate crisis without addressing food systems, as even if we eradicated fossil fuels and addressed all these other issues contributing to the climate crisis, food systems unsustainability enough would put us into really dangerous climate change levels. So it's not an option of not addressing that. Not addressing food systems is not addressing climate change.
And building off of that and kind of giving more local examples of how essential mitigating climate change at the farm level is, through my work with the Barstow's Dairy Farm in Hadley, Massachusetts, we worked on building a carbon calculator to assess how much GHG emissions they were emitting within the years 2012 going into 2019. And so just within the year 2019 alone, they had implemented an anaerobic digester. And so what that did was basically take the waste and make it more productive and allowed them to mitigate their GHG emissions. And so there was that sequestered 900 metric tons of CO2 within 2019. And so just putting that number into context, that would offset about 200 cars GHG emissions per year. So there are really significant opportunities for reducing our climate impact or the climate crisis within the farm level.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, factory farms, monocropping are such big issues related to contributing to the climate crisis, but we have so much potential in transitioning to regenerative organic agriculture to mitigate the climate crisis by building healthy soil that can hold more water and sequester carbon.
Maybe just one more thing on top of all of that is thinking about kind of the compounding issues related to the climate crisis. So as someone who is in a food studies program, I don't just think about food systems, I think about other factors as well. And one of the things to consider when it comes to the climate crisis is how it disproportionately affects communities of color, and they bear the brunt of the consequences of the climate crisis. And so that layer of justice is something really to consider as well. And beyond that, I think the other thing that's really important to consider is the fact that a lot of farms in the US are small farms, which means that for a lot of families for generations, it has been part of their key economic source, or their key economic resources have come from having farms. And so when we're thinking about the climate crisis and how that will change growing conditions for farmers, we can expect that that will greatly impact how small farmers can fare as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And those were all really good points. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, Mackenzie, you mentioned monocropping, and could you just give a brief explanation of what that is for our audience?
Yeah, of course. Sorry for the jargon. Monocropping is essentially just, when you see fence row to fence row of one crop, it's the growing of one crop. And in this country, a lot of our crops that are subsidized are corn and wheat and soybeans. And especially in places like the Midwest, that is what takes up a lot of our land. And there's a lot of studies that show that it decreases soil health when you're exhausting the soil planting the same crop, and also results in biodiversity loss. It's not natural for us to just be planting one crop. I'm sure a lot of you could add to that, but that's just the basics of monocropping.
If I could also jump in, Mackenzie also mentioned factory farming, which is really intensive food animal production. And that also ties into monocropping, because a lot of those crops that Mackenzie just mentioned are subsidized or actually used for animal feed, which goes back into this really intensive production of animal products in factory farms, which also contribute to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions.
Right, thank you. The land isn't actually that's growing the monocrops is not actually going to feed people. It's mostly going to feed animals, and the rest of it is going to processed foods like high fructose corn syrup.
Awesome, yeah. So it seems like we want to move away from single crop farms, focus more on smaller family farms and having more diverse crops. And one solution that's been proposed to try to reach that is regenerative agriculture, which isn't a main plank in Biden's plan, the newly released American Jobs Plan, but it was a big thing in his campaign plan. So what do you guys think is the reason for the exclusion of regenerative agriculture, and also just what are your thoughts on the practice in general?
So maybe we can just start with framing what regenerative agriculture is. So there are kind of like four main pillars of regenerative agriculture. One is soil health or fertility. Another has to do with sustainable kind of water systems. Outside of that, enhancing biodiversity. So going back to the monocropping thing we were bringing up, or rather the opposite of that. And then lastly, the impact of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that come from the agricultural system. And so part of why it's kind of concerning for a lot of folks in agriculture that agriculture wasn't really explicitly mentioned in the American Jobs Plan is because, as we mentioned earlier, there's such a large impact that our food system has on greenhouse gas emissions, and everybody eats. So it's just the kind of thing where it has the potential to really have a large impact if we're able to shift the direction that our food system is going in right now. And I would say another reason why, or rather just answering the question why I think it's not included in the American Jobs Plan, I actually don't think that it's fully not included. I think it's just not directly included. There are a lot of kind of aspects of the American Jobs Plan that I think could connect to regenerative agriculture. So when we're thinking about the investment in research and development, investment in land grant universities, when we're thinking about creating jobs in conservation and things like that, that is increasing our capacity to consider regenerative agriculture in our food system. But I do think it is a problem that it's not directly addressed.
Yes, and like all of that was so amazing, and I really appreciate you laying out the specifics of regenerative agriculture. And building off of that, I think that it brings me back to a conversation that I had the opportunity to have with Gina McCarthy, who's now the National Climate Advisor under the Biden administration. And so within that discussion, I was able to ask directly what plans there would be to support smaller farmers in mitigating climate change. And so within that response, and that was in about February, just for time-wise in context, but she directly mentioned that there would be plans to provide incentives and support systems for Black farmers specifically. And I was actually very happy to hear that she brought that forth and still had that plan for implementing those support systems, because it's so essential. So I definitely agree. And I think that there are definitely going to be more opportunities to make those points of connections, and specifically with the aspects of the plan that deal with the use of idle property and idle land. So there were references to making use of those spaces. And I think that that would be a perfect opportunity to really integrate the use of urban agriculture and community farms that would help to integrate and combine the Regenerative Agriculture Initiative along with what's already in the plan.
That's great. And I think just one thing that's important also to bring up is, when we ask why isn't regenerative agriculture more mentioned in this plan, still a huge issue in our government is this, corporate lobbying and this revolving door between industry and our lawmakers. And we see with Tom Vilsack, after his Obama years, he went and worked as a dairy lobbyist, being paid $1 million a year to do that. So I think it's important that we hold these people accountable and call out the money that, these big dairy, big seed companies, big meat, they all have something to gain by not having these smaller regenerative, healthier systems in place. And so I think we really need to be paying attention to that.
Thank you, Mackenzie, for mentioning that, because that's exactly what I was thinking about, how we always have to watch out when we see things in agriculture not being covered, like more sustainable food systems practices, because there is so often that industry interest behind that, right? When 99% of animal products in US grocery stores come from factory farms, what interest is there in the more mainstream conventional companies for different kinds of practices to be supported that aren't those that they are conducting? So I think that's always something to keep an eye out on. And I also wanted to answer the question that you asked about what we think more in general for regenerative agriculture. I, of course, think that more sustainable food production is extremely important, looking at more agroecology, permaculture, regenerative approaches to food production. I do have some cautions towards the regenerative agriculture language, and that sometimes it is used as a way to avoid addressing the need for changes towards away from, for example, large amounts of industrial meat and dairy consumption in a high-income country such as the United States, because sometimes other interests will say, oh, we can just keep doing what we're already doing and make it more grass-fed, more regenerative, without actually wanting to do that and without realizing that we also need a reduction in the amount that's being consumed in general, because it's simply not sustainable and we won't have the land to eat the amount that we're having, have the same amount of demand, all regenerative. We do need the reduction in addition to the better production practices.
And Lana, when you say reduction, do you mean like reduction in the consumption of animal products specifically, or?
Yes, I especially factory farmed animal products, which is a massive issue in countries such as the United States. The amount that we are consuming just in terms of animal products is already far from compatible with a livable future. And it's especially a lot of the issues that we see in production actually happening in countries such as Brazil and the Amazon rainforest. It's being fueled by the consumption and the demand coming from countries such as the United States that's harming a lot of lands around the world and not just here. So it's a massive issue, and it's being fueled a lot by unsustainable appetites in places like the US.
Yeah, if I could add one more thing there too, related to the US being a major exporter, transportation is a big part of that, right? And so, I mean, I'm in New Hampshire, and so if I am going to my local food retailer and buying an orange, that orange has inevitably traveled thousands of miles to get to my grocery store. And then when we think about that on an even larger scale, when it comes to global trade as well, transportation is a big part of that. And so I might also argue that sustainability in our food system connects to a lot of the transportation efforts also as part of the American Jobs Plan.
Thank you. And I found it really interesting what you said, Mackenzie, about the lobbying power behind the agriculture industry. Like it can be comparable to the big oil lobbyists as like a reason for why this wasn't directly addressed in the plan. So thank you for mentioning that. So moving on to my next question, this one's kind of big, broad, and general. We've been talking a lot about the American Jobs Plan, obviously, so if you've already mentioned some of this, that's fine, but I'm wondering, what do you think is good about the American Jobs Plan? Where do you think, in terms of agriculture, Biden really hits on the head, and where do you think it can be improved and there should be more emphasis put on certain issues?
What I liked about it was, it's not, he didn't call it the Green New Deal, but it certainly had a lot of Green New Deal aspects in it. In terms of combating the climate crisis, we need to address injustices. We need to pay people a livable wage. It felt like it had a lot of those ideas in it. But I know a lot of activists are saying, $2 trillion is not enough. We need to be spending a lot more than that to actually combat this crisis. And I agree with that. In terms of food, I think one thing that could be really exciting in thinking about infrastructure is food procurement and leveraging, federal buying power to get more healthy food in schools, in prisons, and hospitals and places like that. And so I think that can fold really nicely into the infrastructure bill that that language hasn't been added yet. But I think if we're pushing for that, that's certainly something that could go in there. And in terms of regenerative agriculture, I mean, there was nothing about farming. And I think, what was asked him about the American Rescue Plan was that there was a bit of money that's going to go towards BIPOC farmers. But I think that's just the beginning. And I think that there needs to be a lot more support for BIPOC farmers, for beginning farmers to have an entry point into farming and food systems. And I think that there can be a lot more added about regenerative agriculture and paying farmers to do good practices like cover cropping and agroforestry and things like that are already, that can be added into programs that already exist, like the conservation stewardship program. We don't need to invent new programs for that. We just need to have more money so that we can actually pay people to transition to regenerative organic agriculture.
And building off of that, that touches on something that's so important in terms of the entry point for people into farming and continuing to continue the knowledge and keep that knowledge production and transfer of knowledge from older generations to younger generations going, because there are a lot of existing programs. Like I'm thinking of the Farm School NYC that does a lot of work with educating young farmers that are interested in farmers of color that are interested in getting into the field and need the support. And so in a lot of the research that I've done and the interviews that I've had with Black farmers across the US, one of the main things are the capital needed to start farming, and whether that's increased access to loans or thinking about even education around organic farming practices and just the products needed for organic farming and sustainable farming. In particular, there was one farmer who had expressed this or shared a story with me, and he mentioned that in the 1 year he implemented organic farming, he'd invested $200,000 into his 30 acres of land, and in turn, he received a profit of about $900. So it was essentially a loss for that year, just trying to do organic farming and trying to implement sustainable practices. So it's really important to have, as you were mentioning, Mackenzie, have that support system through finances for the already existing programming and the farmers, the Black farmers that are already doing this work.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Storm. I think it sounds to me at least really simple, just getting BIPOC farmers more monetary resources so they can implement sustainable practices. So that's definitely something that should be a part of the plan. So thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that question before we move on?
Oh, I was just going to say that, I mean, obviously I'm glad you referenced agriculture, conservation, food resilience, economic funds, investment, but I really do think that is the minimum, and we do need addressing more climate justice, climate crisis in general. We've been talking about BIPOC farmers support and support of sustainable methods and food systems, just more like concretely put out there. I think that there is a lot more that could go along this path.
Yeah, I completely agree, Lana. So looking at the American Jobs Plan as it stands right now, the big things in there are economic opportunities for farmers, resilient food systems, and investment in climate smart technologies, which they're all in there, but it's a little bit vague as to like how they'd be implemented. Um, so, how do you guys think that these big, broad goals that the Biden administration has put out there, how do you think they should be implemented, like in your dream world? And maybe we can just start with talking about economic opportunities, take it one by one.
Yeah, I mean, I think as some of us said earlier, direct payments is one of the best policy tools at a federal level when it comes to dealing with food systems and farmers in particular. And so I think some of the things that were mentioned earlier, like incentivizing more sustainable modes of production, is one of those things that we could look to hopefully expect from the Biden administration, although it might not fall under the American Jobs Plan. As some of us mentioned earlier too, there's a direction in the general kind of agriculture world right now in the administration that's hopefully starting to consider direct payments as a solution.
Yeah, and I'm very wary of the whole climate smart technologies in Biden's language. And I think someone mentioned this earlier that just, the term regenerative, it can really lose its meaning and become greenwashed really easily. And we're already seeing that with corporations like General Mills and Danone and McDonald's that are talking about, being excited to sequester carbon and get payments for that. And I think at the end of the day, if they're just growing crap to feed people, it really doesn't matter for sequestering carbon. And there's so many questions too about how much carbon can we actually sequester. If we're sequestering it and then we're destroying the land, all of that carbon will go back into the atmosphere. So there's questions around that. But I think going back, small farmers, indigenous folks already know how to manage the land, and we just need to give more of that land to them, because small farmers, BIPOC farmers, at the end of the day, are the ones that are going to be protecting us from the climate crisis. I really believe, and I just think, more like the direct payments and increasing ways for people to become farmers, as opposed to getting into these climate smart technologies, because I think that is just those subsidies and payments and will end up just going to really large corporations.
It's interesting too, thinking about how subsidies would play out, or how this money would be distributed. Because I think about, like, with Barstow's, the farm that I mentioned, they engage in a partnership with Kabat Farms, and they don't own the anaerobic digester that they're using and that they're benefiting from. So I'm thinking about these alternative ways of having these smaller farms, because they only have about 400 dairy cows. So having these smaller farms get access to some of these climate smart technologies, because they can be so beneficial. But it's, as you're mentioning, Mackenzie, it's a fine line between having these large scale policies that may only reach the larger farms, but then really, how do you get those climate smart technologies to the smaller farmers? And so I think that cooperative style technology, like practices, or having the tools accessible by having maybe more communal forms of use could be beneficial. And then also, I think there was within previous proposals, there was a mention of a carbon market to incentivize carbon capture. And so I'd be interested to see how that would play out for the smaller farms as well. Like, would they really be able to benefit if they're able to access these climate smart technologies to actually be using and implementing to then benefit from those carbon incentives?
I think there's so many things to be cautious about here, especially around carbon capture. With looking to Elon Musk type solutions, I'm not sure if any of you have seen where he's just asking for people to come out and find climate solutions when they already exist, especially like in agriculture. Like we've already seen sustainable food systems exist with indigenous peoples before. So I think it's really something to keep an eye on to make sure that it doesn't go back into greenwashing, and companies that are offsetting their emissions by like buying credits and like doing tree planting schemes, and just like a lot of what we're seeing right now with like net zero, where it's like they want to keep doing what they've always been doing but find a loophole so that they can say it's sustainable. It's just something we have to be really careful about as we're going to that area.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that has been said, and this will be one of my last questions, but a lot of Biden's plan focuses on conservation in the sense of cleaning up toxic waste sites and private land conservation. So, do you agree with this prioritization, and just what are your thoughts on that in general?
I could start. I think it's great to be cleaning up toxic sites. Absolutely. There seems to be a lack of clarity and some controversy around this private land conservation. If it means taking agriculture land out of production, then I think a more logical approach would be focusing on programs that would transition industrial farming operations into more regenerative farming systems. And again, if the subsidies for these large scale crop and livestock producers were reduced or eliminated, and transition programs would be in place, I think this would happen as a consequence of individual farming decisions. So I think, yeah, I don't know how this private land conservation will play out, but I'm interested to learn more about it.
Honestly, no. Like, I don't think these should be his priorities, and I don't think this would be anyone's priorities. If you asked any of us, if you asked any of these spaces, youth, farmers, civil society, I think even if you ask people on the street, like what Biden's priorities should be, it wouldn't be this. So I think he really needs to listen more to those on the front lines, and that includes BIPOC, it includes farmers, it includes young people.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any other thoughts on that, because I think you guys summed it up pretty well, we've talked about a lot today. So thank you all for all of your thoughts. For my last question, I just want to ask if you guys were talking directly to the Biden administration and advising them on policy, what in summation would be the main priorities that you want them to focus on?
Sure, yeah. So I think going back to some of the things Mackenzie mentioned earlier about a lot of commercial, large-scale farms receiving a lot of the benefits of federal programs. We saw that happen with COVID relief. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that happened again under the American Jobs Plan. So I think whether it's a part of the American Jobs Plan or just more broadly, we need to really think about how direct payments are being distributed to farms. I think incorporating them to, again, incentivize some of these more sustainable practices is a really key direction that we should be going in. And with that, considering also layers of equity with relation to farming. So as we mentioned, prioritizing indigenous communities and other sovereign communities, and prioritizing farmers of color as well, I think are all great directions for the Biden administration moving forward with respect to agriculture.
Yeah, I would definitely second all of that. And I think having more specific policies that provide, I think, not just funding, and not just funding for BIPOC communities and farmers, but really thinking of alternative ways to strengthen food systems. So I think there's often a lot of times there's these like key surface level ways of addressing food justice and thinking of food access. And so I really want to go back to this idea of food sovereignty, which aligns a lot with regenerative agriculture and thinking about the land and cultivating the land and maintaining that resource for people, and not just thinking about agriculture in terms of for rural communities or just for urban communities, but really having a more holistic approach so that we can really provide people with culturally appropriate food that is coming from local farmers, and so that people feel more connected to where their food is coming from. And so I think financial incentives would definitely be important, and also, as was said, really supporting pre-existing efforts, because the work is already being done. So we need to uplift what people are already doing in these communities.
That was really well said. I don't know if I would need to add anything to that, but I think in Biden's mind, maybe farming doesn't seem to be included in the plan because only 1% of people in the U.S. are farmers, but actually 10% of jobs in this country are related in some sense to food or agriculture space, and I think that the health of this country, especially after being in the middle of a global pandemic, health should be our utmost priority. And healthy farming systems isn't just helpful for farmers, it's helpful for anybody who eats food, and it's helpful for our environment. And so my really wonky ask to Biden would be, to transition away from crop insurance reform and place it with a whole farm net revenue insurance program that could support farmers in this transition. That would be my wonky ask. But I think everything that Storm and Abby have said already really paints the picture for what we need in this country.
I love all of those, and I do have 4 very quick, straightforward asks. 1, to ban factory farming. 2,
Woo.
to incorporate thank you, incorporate sustainability into the dietary guidelines and to align procurement, which means like places like school cafeterias to be aligned with this sustainability considered dietary guidelines. 3, to shift subsidies away from fast food, factory farming, and towards supporting people's access to healthy, fresh foods such as fruits and vegetables. And 4, to put investment into sustainable practices like we've been talking about today, and also into alternative protein, because we're getting to that point and we need it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your knowledge, for sharing your wisdom. Really appreciate it. I feel like I've learned a lot, and hopefully our audience has too. And we'll give it back to Syed.
Well, that was another brilliant and insightful panel from another array of awesome young people talking about transportation, talking about food systems. And, I think when we talk about our food systems, and what we really delved into in this panel was talking about a holistic understanding of our food systems and understanding how, of course, funding and things like that are important to transform our food systems, but that we really need to also focus on important things like food justice, food access, food sovereignty, our land, and prioritizing the Black and Brown communities that our food systems impact as well. And so I think that when we talk about taking action on our food systems, one way that you at home can get involved is to support the Farm System Reform Act, which there will be a link in the chat right here to Food and Water Watch. You can also find it at OneUpAction.org. This act is something that addresses large-scale animal agriculture, specifically addressing confined animal feeding operations. It was introduced by Senator Cory Booker and Ro Khanna. And so I recommend you take a look at the act and take a look at the link and sign this petition if it's something that you want to support to build us to get closer to a more regenerative and more sustainable food system. And again, any of those links, if you missed it in the chat, you can also find at OneUpAction.org, OneUpAction.org. Our next panel, which I'm very excited about, is on clean energy. And I think when we talk about climate change and climate justice and a just transition, one thing that's essential in any sort of framing of this dialogue is talking about clean energy. We know how unsustainable the fossil fuel industry is. We know how polluting coal and oil and gas are to our atmosphere. We know that we need to move away from these types of dirty, dangerous, polluting energies that pollute our air, emit carbon into the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, and ultimately damage our lungs and damage the planet too. And so this particular segment is going to focus for, something really important, which is clean power. And when we talk about clean power, we know that in the US, our power sector is one of the most polluting. in Joe Biden's American Jobs Plan, he really has a major focus on boosting clean energy and improving clean energy standards in such a way that improves and makes sure that utilities across the country improve their share in terms of usage of renewable and clean energies. And so we're already seeing an increase in funding, or at least talking about an increase in funding for renewable energy systems. And so this panel I'm excited for because it's really going to delve into not just funding, but get into some of the specifics on manufacturing, on electric vehicles, on electric heating, in our housing and commercial buildings. And so I really hope you can take a lot from this panel on clean energy. And so get ready for this awesome panel on clean energy featuring some more amazing young climate intersectional activists.
Hello again and welcome back. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Operations at OneUpAction, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. In this clean energy panel, we'll be going over Biden's plans for manufacturing, electric vehicles, retrofitting, housing and commercial buildings, and much more. But before we get into all of that, let's meet our panelists.
Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Phil. He, him pronouns. I'm currently living in Austin, Texas, from Katy, Texas, originally, just outside of Houston. I am one of the co-founders and the media director for Intersectional Environmentalists. I host the podcast Just to Save the World, and many of you may or may not know me from TikTok.
Hey everyone, I'm Alicia. I am zooming in from Orlando, Florida, which is where I'm from. I'm Director of Engagement at Future Coalition and also a student at Georgetown, so Zoom University. And I'm so excited to be here today to chat about these important topics.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Mebane, based in Washington, D.C. I'm also the U.S. Policy Director of 350.org.
Great, thank you guys. So excited to be here and talk to you all. So just to start off this conversation, I'll keep it broad. What do you guys like about Biden's clean energy plan, and what do you think can be improved? And whoever has any thoughts on that can just start us off.
I'll start. I definitely liked, well, first of all, it's the boldest plan by far that I think we've seen come out of the US government. I think looking back even a year ago, something like this being even proposed was probably unheard of outside of maybe like Bernie Sanders' mouth. And I think that a lot of the language is more centered on environmental justice and equity than we might have expected. One of the things that I didn't like that I noticed reading through it is that solar and wind energy aren't really mentioned. Wind is mentioned once. Solar was mentioned 0 times, and yet carbon capture and nuclear were mentioned multiple times each. So that was kind of the one thing I pinpointed that I would criticize.
I would say something, very similar in that I do like the fact that it is, it's targeting changing our energy system, but at the same time, as you mentioned, Aiken, that it does mention energy systems that we do not want to continue on within the 21st century. Overall, I think a lot of things I liked about it weren't even so much even the energy provisions, but more so, replacing all the lead pipes across America. I think that's an issue that has been talked about extensively, but pretty much ignored. And there hasn't really been an effort to actually fix that problem. And just overall, even providing things like broadband internet. If you live in an area where that's easily accessible, you don't think about it. But there are so many communities that are sort of cut off from the information world, and that also cuts a lot of opportunities. So I think what I liked most about it was that it wasn't just about infrastructure of bridges and roads and things like that need to be repaired, but it was also thinking about sort of the infrastructure that makes the country work overall.
I totally agree. And I have to echo what Philip said, that, the conversation around environmental justice just hasn't been a part of the broader conversation. pretty much until recently. And I was just really impressed with how Biden has, kind of stated clearly that, low-income communities, bear the brunt of the climate crisis, and is very specific in tackling that. So I think that that's one nuance that we're getting to see now that I'm really excited about.
Great, thank you, everyone. And just moving on, a common misconception about switching to renewable energy is that it's going to take away jobs from people working in oil and gas companies, which obviously we don't want to do. So, can you comment on Biden's plan to maintain a just transition for these workers and create jobs in the clean energy sector?
Sure, I'd love to chime in on this. I think that the goal is not to hold on to jobs in dirty energy sector. That isn't the goal. The goal is not to have as many, gas drillers, oil drillers, coal miners as there were in the past. The goal is to have more jobs and to have new jobs in clean energy. And currently in solar alone, there's 300,000 or so solar jobs in America and less than 50,000 coal jobs. And that's been the case for many years. And so there are significantly more, hundreds of thousands of more clean energy jobs currently in existence across America than there are dirty energy jobs. And that's been a fact for many years. And so it's kind of having the idea of why should we expand more clean energy jobs? Why should we have even more jobs that people can make a good living wage without polluting the environment that they live in? Why would we not? Nobody would say they'd rather have a coal job where their own communities are the ones suffering versus having a clean energy job, which can do the same thing without poisoning themselves, their families, and their own lives. So overall, in terms of Biden's plan, I mean, I think that when you put in the infrastructure investments, laying the groundwork for what's necessary to expand clean energy, then the jobs follow automatically. And so everything, even just from even overall construction of maintaining what we already have. So I think for me, seeing his plan and knowing that it will create millions of jobs because of the work that it's putting in to fix the infrastructure of the country and to expand access to clean energy.
I totally agree. I absolutely love that Biden is creating jobs in clean energy, and it's the direction that we should be going in. I think I would also love to see just a greater emphasis on helping people transition into these new jobs. It's a huge life change, and so I would love to see just more social programs around like resettling into these new jobs. Which is, I think, an important point for a lot of people in this conversation, in job transition.
Yeah, agree with both Natalie and Alicia and what Alicia just said about the transition. The plan did mention several times training, but it didn't mention how it was going to get like easy, affordable, accessible, or free training to people. So I was kind of like wanting more details about how that would happen. And then for myself, I actually started my career in energy at a carbon capture plant, at a coal plant, carbon capture system being built. So like I'm very close to, and living in Texas, so many of my friends work in fossil fuel industries. And for so many Americans, especially in rural areas, especially in the South, for a long time, fossil fuel jobs have been the only well-paying jobs for those communities. So emphasis on not only like the training and transition, but ensuring to those Americans that these jobs will be even better, and they will also contribute to building like a cleaner future for all Americans. So yeah, I think that emphasis needs to be there on training and on recognizing, hopefully that they recognize that so many people rely so heavily on those jobs. And I do like the fact that they mentioned and went into detail about unionizing and about labor standards, and put an emphasis on that.
I just want to add that I totally agree with you. And I think the point that you brought up about clarity is, again, just so important. It's not just enough to mention these trainings. It really needs to be very clear about how it's accessible for everybody. So definitely a greater emphasis like on this point and just clarity for the everyday American to access these trainings.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that has been said. And so, what I've gathered so far is that we want more specific language on how the transition in terms of jobs is going to be, as well as more emphasis on solar and wind. So, all really great suggestions. But something that is emphasized very heavily within the plan is climate smart technologies and putting more clean energy technologies. So, do you agree with how much the Biden plan has prioritized that aspect of things? And also, what sort of clean energy technologies do you expect to see in the future?
I think that some of the technologies that I would look forward to is first of all, making renewable energy circular. I would love to see research and development go into that. I did love how much focus they put on investing in research and development. I've been pretty disappointed in the past at how much money we've spent on that in the US versus other countries. But knowing that solar and wind even aren't where they need to be in terms of equity and resource extraction and becoming waste free, I would love to see an emphasis not only on solar and wind in general, which again wasn't mentioned, but on making them circular, and also on developing other renewable energy sources like tidal, wave, offshore wind. So I'm excited to see if and how much we invest in those technologies.
And Phil, sorry, just for our audience, could you clarify what you mean by making renewable energy circular? Some people might not understand that.
Sure, definitely. I think for any technology to be actually sustainable and hopefully regenerative, going beyond sustainability, it needs to not have waste, because waste is inherently unsustainable. If we use resources that go into design, even in clean energy technologies, even in solar PV or wind, we have to extract new materials if there's waste. So that means we have to mine. And generally that's happening in other countries, not the US, that we don't see. That's, taking land from indigenous peoples, that's destroying natural habitats. So in order for even solar and wind to be actually sustainable, they need to be circular, meaning that everything that goes into them and their design material-wise can be reused.
I totally agree. And I like your point about investing in the, in research for clean energy. I think this was about just investing in clean energy broadly, but there was like a 27% increase. I'm not sure how much of that was specifically for research, but I think that it's not just enough to say that, you're a champion of clean energy if you're not, relaying that in the budget, if you're not putting in what research needs to get done, which is, money, and, research needs to be funded. So totally agree that investment is a huge part of it, and also just encouraging companies to invest in clean energy themselves. And there are so many ways, to do that through different caps and taxes and things like that, to also, encourage the private sector to, innovate and invest in clean energy.
One thing I want to bring up that you mentioned, Philip, is that you talked about things being circular, that even if you're building clean energy technologies, we still have to ensure that they're sustainable. So, even with solar panels, there's a lot of materials that are rare earth minerals. Same thing with lithium ion batteries. We need them for our phones, but we also need them for, so far, the battery technologies that we use in electric vehicles. And so I do think that that's a good idea of looking at it as it's not enough to just create clean energy, but are we making sustainable energy? It's great that this plan, plans on really building out our electric car fleets, which is great, getting off of gas. The number one contributor of greenhouse gases in our economy is from transportation, then followed by power plants. And so transportation is actually the biggest savings that we can get when it comes to clean energy. And so I really like that the plan has huge plans to actually transition, our system of transportation off of gas. But at the same time, we also have to deal with the increased demand that will come for lithium-ion batteries. And how do we actually produce that in a way that isn't causing other, environmental problems with other mines later on? And so it's sort of that whole idea of like we're taking one step forward, but we also have to do it in a bigger way in terms of our long-term planning of, are we creating a system that is also unsustainable? But I do think that the initial investments in getting off of gas for our transportation, as well as overall transitioning the grid with clean energy standards, which is also included, is definitely the first step we can take.
Yeah, and Natalie, you mentioned electric vehicles, and that leads me into another question I had. So some critics of Biden's plan are saying that spending on electric vehicles on charging stations could result in an emphasis on personal transportation rather than trying to rely more on public transport, and that could increase emissions. So do you agree with that statement? And if so, what are your suggestions on how to meet this problem?
Well, I think that in the US in general, unfortunately, our infrastructure, our cities, our towns have been really built around the car in general. I think that there was a time where there were trains that would take you from this town to that town. And essentially, when the private vehicle became very popular, that went away. It was no longer cost effective to have that public transportation. And I think that a lot of folks would prefer, if they had the choice of not driving, to have the ability to go from one town to the next on a train. And I think that one good thing about this plan is that it does also invest in light rail. It invests in high speed rail so that you don't have to fly to get up to the city. You can actually take the train and not have to deal with the hassle of airports. Also, train stations typically drop you off in downtown of the city, whereas airports, I don't know any places that have airports downtown, And so the convenience of mass transit is already there when you invest in it. In terms of the electric vehicles, I don't think that people driving a gas car now and the next car they buy being electric makes them drive more or less. If you live in an area where you do rely on a car, right, which is most places in the US, then you would rather have your car charged, be electric, and not have to worry about gas. It also has a lot less maintenance costs, electric vehicles. And the thing is, though, you can't buy an electric vehicle if the infrastructure isn't there and if they're not affordable. If you purchased a new car, that's a long-term investment. And I think that what we need to do is start showing people that the infrastructure is there, that they will have a place to charge their car, because not everybody lives in a house with a garage where they can plug it in at night. That's not realistic for most people. And what happens to the person that lives in an apartment? Do they just not get the luxury of having an electric car? I want an electric car. And so I think that you have to make the investment. And, I would love to become less reliant on a car in general with mass transit, but we also have to accept that, unfortunately, our entire nation's infrastructure was already built around the personal vehicle. And that's not going to change overnight, but at least we can reduce our emissions significantly by having the electric investment. So I'm really excited. That's actually the part I think I'm the most excited about, other than replacing the lead pipes, is the fact that we might actually, in the near future, be able to transition off of gas-powered cars completely.
Yeah, Natalie definitely took my main point, which was that we spent 100 years developing our infrastructure around personal vehicles. And like many people have said, cities are built for cars, not for people. So that infrastructure is going to take way longer to change than, say, energy infrastructure, which a new solar plant can go up in 6 months. You can't redesign a city in 6 months. So yeah, I think personal vehicles will be a part of our society, whether we like it or not, for quite some time. I think something to add to that is going back to what Natalie said about battery technology before, and lithium ion. For electric vehicles to be truly more sustainable and equitable in the future, I think we need massive advancements in battery technology. Luckily, that's one of the most heavily invested in industries in the world, and there's tons of exciting new battery technologies that have been developed that just need to be scaled up. So I think that as we transition, there needs to be a lot of focus for the US in continuing to invest in battery technologies that are more sustainable. And then also that just an interesting thing that I like about the potential with electric vehicles is being able to use them for energy storage in microgrid situations. So like in an apartment situation, if it's planned for that, and if the city and state and federal government incentivize it, you can actually put solar on top of an apartment and then use everyone's cars in the parking garage or around the building to store the excess solar energy in the middle of the day. But again, like for many like low-income housing units or whatever, they're going to need government assistance to be able to have that. So I would love to see that become a focus as well.
I totally agree. I think, Natalie, you hit the nail on the head. And we see the issue of the US being built on reliance on, automobiles in daily life. Like I live in Florida. My friend in New York, says like, oh, I don't have a car. I use public transportation. I'm like, I could not go anywhere without a car, even going to like my closest grocery store is a really, really long walk. So I think definitely it's learning and unlearning and redoing our system, because right now it's not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that has been said here. Thank you guys. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about the new green energy electricity standard, clean electricity standard that was set forth in the plan. So do you think that standard is in alignment with what was set in the Paris Climate Accords, and what do you think could be improved upon?
I'll just add again that the only thing mentioned in the segment that described what that clean energy standard was, the only energy specifically mentioned were I think hydrogen and then again nuclear, and there's no mention of solar and wind again. On the Paris Climate Accord, I think most of us would agree that that was never bold enough for what actually needs to happen. But in this plan, they specifically state carbon-free, the entire electricity sector being carbon-free by 2035, which again, I think was unheard of. And I think that number came directly from youth climate organizations like OneUpAction demanding that number be brought closer to now and be bolder, because I think without the work that youth climate organizations have done over the past few years, that number would probably be 2050 still. So I think in terms of that, I was happy to see that it was that bold.
I would say in terms of the 2035 deadline, I know, during the campaign time, we were pushing him to do 2030 as the deadline for 100% clean energy. And I want to differentiate between, in the plan, it says carbon-free energy. Now, that is the hint that he's talking about nuclear. For me, I mean, this is a position from, both 350.org, but also my own, is that nuclear is not clean, safe, sustainable, or renewable. You have to mine uranium. It's a mine, just like any other mineral. You have to mine it. You have to go to a community, dig it up, accept the fact that that's a sacrifice zone, that they're going to be breathing in the toxic uranium that goes into their bodies. There's babies being born with uranium already in their bodies because their mothers have absorbed it from living in areas near uranium mines out west. So one thing with nuclear is that it's not safe. As we all know, it's not safe. It's definitely not clean. We have that little problem called nuclear waste and uranium mining. And it's the most expensive energy ever created. It's the most expensive way to ever boil water we've ever come up with. So for me, I'm disappointed that the plan is obviously planning to rely heavily on nuclear. I would wish that instead it was only clean, renewable, sustainable, and safe energy. So that is, to me, one of the main disappointments, is that it does seem like to be a very big nod to the nuclear industry. On top of that, with 2035, I mean, yes, that's massively, better than 2050, which was his original plans when he was running for office. But in reality, if we're going to listen to what the science says, what the IPCC says, we have to completely transform our energy systems well before then. And we have to make the investment now, not just in the US, but around the world, so that by 2030, we're not burning fossil fuels. And I don't think people really understand the magnitude of the shift that we have to take both for our energy generation and for our electrical, overall our transportation as well. So I think that there is nothing that is considered too bold considering what we're up against. Because if we fail, we're accepting the demise of human civilization. And I don't think anyone here is willing to take that risk or chance.
Yeah, I want to tag on to that. I'm 100% against nuclear energy. And again, it makes absolutely no sense to build new infrastructure for nuclear energy when solar and wind is not only so much cheaper, but again, can be built so quickly. It is the quickest infrastructure to put up. One thing that I am hopeful about in terms of setting like 2035 goals is that you can't build new nuclear infrastructure by 2035. It just takes longer than that. Like the process to get it approved and then the construction process takes so long for nuclear. So my hope is that the expectation with that 2035 is that a lot of money will flow into solar and wind energy. And a lot of times in the past, when governments have set dates like that and actually put the investment behind it, they've beat those goals. So I think with the 2035, that potentially in 5 years, we could easily push that up to 2030. But yeah, I agree with everything that Natalie said there.
I totally agree as well. And I have to say that for that standard specifically, what stood out to me the most, again, was the year change. And like Philip said, it came directly from youth activists. Like, I was shocked at how the language almost mimicked that of what youth activists were demanding. And I think that, this was the first election that I was able to vote in. And I think that just seeing for the first time in history, an administration working with young activists so closely, I think is really inspiring, and just, shows how important civic engagement is in people, and how people's movement are really what are going to, the people's movement is really what's going to propel governments to take action on clean energy.
Great. And this is going to be my last question. So if you were in front of the Biden administration right now and you could give a quick 1 minute elevator pitch on what needs to be changed about Biden's plan regarding clean energy, what should be improved, what he needs to add, what would you say if you had that power? I know you might need a second to think, but whoever wants to.
No, I already know, because it's been bothering me since it came out. Definitely any reference to nuclear and carbon capture sequestration. A lot of folks are probably confused, like, what is, carbon capture? Mainly, it's something that the fossil fuel industry uses as an excuse to continue operating, saying, don't worry, we can still burn gas, we can still burn coal and everything else. We will, trap our carbon and store it underground forever. And to create this system of underground tunnels of pipes that would cost literally trillions of dollars in their own right. So I would say, please take out any funding in reference to both nuclear and investing in carbon capture sequestration. Because if you're saying we have to capture our carbon for the fossil fuels we're using, you're talking about investing billions and trillions of dollars in extending the life of those power plants, rather than just simply decommissioning them and replacing them with 100% clean energy. And so that would be the one thing I would take out and use that money to further our investment in clean energy upfront.
So I would echo Natalie, and the main thing being removing nuclear references altogether. The one thing I did notice with the carbon capture language is that when they got specific with it, they mentioned using it for manufacturing and specifically cement, which honestly I was unfamiliar with that as something that they were even working on. So I honestly don't know whether or not that is feasible. I know that our infrastructure, again, is largely built around cement in terms of building foundations and roads and sidewalks and all those things. So in that particular instance, that might be helpful. But then adding to that, I think that going back to the training and really detailed language on how you're going to have so many workers adequately trained and giving access to everyone who wants it. So I would love to see that as a specific plan, as like an offshoot of this one.
I agree with everything that was said. And Philip, you kind of took my answer. I was going to go back to the jobs training, and I was going to say, again, just like clear, specific language, a plan for people to follow, and accessibility, make it, a website that people can very easily go to sign up for a training. So just going back to that point, and clearer language and accessibility in general.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone. That was my last question. I feel like I've learned a lot from this panel, and I really appreciate all of your time, and we'll throw it back to Syed.
That was so important and so inspiring. What really stood out to me was Natalie's comments on jobs following from investment. I think if we're going towards more renewable and more sustainable types of energy, of course we need to support those jobs through funding. And of course we need to support that work through funding. But that's ultimately going to lead to more jobs and more infrastructure for people to have in their personal lives to really feel the impacts of these transformative changes that we're having in society. And so I think that aspect of jobs following investment is really important. I also think what Philip was saying about really needing a cultural shift away from, having jobs in fossil fuels is going to be really important. And so it's important that as we're having these discussions, we start talking about and normalizing the need to have people transition into these jobs and really start getting people ready to getting into these new industries, these new growing industries in solar. If you want to take action on some of this stuff, you can sign this petition, which is in the chat, as well as on OneUpAction.org. And this petition is to demand that Congress supports Joe Biden's plan to decarbonize the electric grid by 2035. So if that's something you're into, definitely recommend you sign that petition. At the end of the day, we can talk all we want, but things are only going to change if we're taking these actions, if we're mobilizing, if we're, like Alicia was saying, getting out and voting. As the co-founder of Plus One Vote, I know how important it is that young people and BIPOC communities get out and organize and vote on issues that they care about, like climate change and like social justice. And it's really important that our representatives take hold of these issues as well. We actually have someone really awesome to now speak to us, who is the representative from Michigan's 9th Congressional District. We have Congressman Andy Leving to tell us about his views on the climate crisis.
Thank you so much to OneUpAction for inviting me to participate in your event today. If we're going to address the climate crisis and put our country on a path to 100% clean energy and zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, then we've got to make the decarbonization of the transportation sector a major component of President Biden's American Jobs Plan. The transportation sector represents the largest source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and climate experts agree overwhelmingly that electrification is one of the best options to address climate change within the transportation sector. That's because electric engines are way more efficient than combustion engines, and they reduce the amount of energy needed for transportation by about 2/3. Additionally, when electric engines run on power from renewable energy, we will have decarbonized the ground transportation sector, which is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions by sector. That's exactly what my Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act with Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and Representative Ocasio-Cortez will accomplish. The Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act establishes a grant program which is modeled after the Department of Transportation's Better Utilizing Investments to Leverage Development, or BUILD, discretionary grant program. That successful program provides a unique opportunity for the DOT to invest in road, rail, transit, and port projects that promise to achieve nationwide objectives. Our bill differs from the previous grant program in that it addresses the climate crisis and our crumbling infrastructure simultaneously by providing funding for roads, bridges, and rail, while also electrifying our public transportation systems, including buses, school buses, rail, cars, and fleet vehicles. The bill also requires new renewable energy generation to offset the energy used by newly electrified infrastructure. Use more electricity, get more of it from renewables. In total, the bill provides $500 billion in grant funding over 10 years, with important labor provisions to ensure workers are afforded their rights and are paid living wages. Such an investment is an incredible job creation proposition. In fact, Data for Progress estimated that enacting the Build Green Act would create almost 1 million jobs, with labor requirements that would ensure these workers are paid no less than $15 an hour, and often more with prevailing wage requirements, that they have at least 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave, and there are protections for fair scheduling and labor neutrality, so that grant recipients must work with their employees to create family-friendly schedules, and they can't use our funding to fight unionization efforts. The Build Green Act is the investment we need to expand transportation electrification with urgency and create good-paying union jobs. In addition to the Build Green Act, we must also encourage our country's needed shift to electric vehicles so that we can end our dependence on fossil fuel using conventional vehicles. To do that, we've got to enact the EV Freedom Act, my bill to create a network of high-speed EV chargers across the national highway system in 5 years. This bill will create thousands of good-paying jobs with robust Buy American provisions and prevailing wage requirements to protect hardworking Americans. I applaud President Biden's commitment to fighting climate change through EV charging and transportation electrification. I believe the EV Freedom Act and Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act are two of the most important policies to get us there. They put the meat on the bones of President Biden's promises to electrify transportation and set up EV charging infrastructure. We can supercharge our economy and create the jobs of the future. We can unify our country in a sustainable way and lead the world in green energy infrastructure. But we can't just do it by a bunch of Congress people talking about it. To really get these bills over the finish line, we need to hear from you. We need pressure from the grassroots, from the communities in every state. And that's why I'm so grateful OneUpAction is in the game. I congratulate you for your activism. We're counting on you to help us push these bills across the finish line. Thanks.
That was so awesome. Thank you so much, Congressman Andy Levin. That, I think that the ambition of those bills that you're introducing is really getting us toward where we need to go on the climate crisis, really talking about, EVs, talking about clean jobs, clean energy, and doing it at a fast term scale, that 5-year mark you mentioned, that's the type of, ambition that we really need to be seeing on bills that are addressing the climate crisis. We already know the climate crisis is happening now. So thank you so much for your work on addressing this. And, we young people look forward to holding you and your colleagues accountable. Today our event was so wonderful. We had these incredible, inspiring panels brought to us from OneUpAction, which is really such a great organization that has been mobilizing and organizing young people to address the climate crisis. And if you would like to donate to support the efforts of OneUpAction, you can go to OneUpAction.org. You can also find that link in the chat. If you can, please donate to OneUpAction. We, highly encourage you to support the work of OneUpAction. And also feel free to follow OneUpAction on Instagram at OneUpAction, ONE, OneUpAction. If you missed anything from today, you missed the panels, you missed some events, some speakers, or you missed some of our sources for how you can take action on a lot of these issues on environmental justice, on transportation, on agriculture, on clean energy, you can go to oneupaction.org and find all that information right there. Thank you so much for, coming in, tuning in, and really sitting with us to delve deep into these issues. Right now, we're in the midst of Earth Week. Tomorrow is Earth Day, and it's really important that for this day, we really take a moment, sit back, and reflect on all of the changes we need to see in our society. The science makes incredibly clear how quickly and how urgently we need to act on the climate crisis. And when you look at those realities of the climate crisis, and when you see how much Black and Brown, Indigenous, BIPOC communities are impacted first and foremost by the climate crisis, it becomes clear how quickly we need to take action. And so it's been really inspiring to be able to work with all these youth activists, all these young people, all these people of color who've been organizing on the front lines to tackle this crisis and to demand change, not just in some sort of superfluous kind of way, but in a very direct way, with the biggest leaders of our nation working all the way from the ground straight to the White House. And so I'm really proud of the young people who have been organizing and pushing, and we're going to continue this fight. To close out our amazing Actions for the Earth Symposium, I'm going to throw it back to the team at OneUpAction for a closing video. So guys, I'll let you take it and close up our amazing event. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm Saad Amer, and here we go. Happy Earth Day.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Corey for that amazing, breathtaking performance. And special thanks to Bill McKibben, as well as our amazing host, Saad Amer. And lastly, to Representative Annie Levin for that amazing video. Also want to thank our amazing producers, Simpatico, for producing our event, and special thanks to our streaming partners, Good, follow at Good, and Simpatico on Instagram. It is critical to do the work of unpacking government plans and to fight the climate crisis. If everyone fully understands these plans, we can hold governments accountable.
Yes, I am definitely inspired to continue taking action, and we hope you feel the same way. Check out our social media at OneUpAction, along with our website to read through our sources and educational guidebooks, along with our 3 programs.
OneUpAction is a small grassroots organization. That means that we rely solely on the generosity of people like you to keep our programs afloat. If you like what you saw today, help us keep organizing by visiting our website to make a donation of any amount, because any amount helps. Our goal is to raise $20,000 to support BIPOC and marginalized youth fighting against the climate crisis.
Thank you all again for participating today, and we hope you learned something new. Stay tuned and visit our website for more information on how to get involved. To help us continue the fight, please do not forget to donate and take action.
Thank you all again for supporting and participating in the #Actions for the Earth Symposium. Thank you for coming.